Pride Ring had a rhythm on extermination days. Sinners scattered. Overlords retreated behind wards. The streets emptied except for the unlucky, the stupid, and the ones who thought they could hide. The exorcists descended in formation wings, cutting through sulfur haze. Their masks reflected nothing. Angelic steel sang as it found flesh. This was order. This was necessary. Population control wrapped in divine mandate. Loot led the sweep through the eastern quarter. Her spear dripped black ichor. 3 sinners down. Quota barely started. She banked left, scanning for movement. There. A figure pressed against rubble. Female, trembling, not running. Loot angled her dive. Clean strike. The sinner looked up. Her hands were empty. Her eyes were wet. Something made Loot pause. Half a second. Long enough to register the demon wasn't fighting back. Wasn't cursing. Just shaking. The spear drove down anyway. Loot felt the impact. Felt the body go slack. Felt the small thrill that always came with a kill. The thought surfaced unbidden. This one was easy. She pulled the spear free. Turned to rejoin formation. The air changed. Heat rolled across the street. Not hell's ambient scorch. Something older. Something that made angelic steel feel suddenly cold in her grip. Loot's wings faltered. She twisted midair. He stood in the center of the avenue. No warning. No portal. Just there. Leather jacket black as void. Skull wreathed in flame that didn't flicker, didn't waver. Burned with the patience of something that had all eternity. The chain hung loose in his hand. Didn't rattle. Didn't move. Just waited. Loot raised her spear. By heaven's authority, he looked at her, not a glance, a judgment. His eyes were hollow sockets filled with fire that didn't warm, didn't rage. Just saw. Saw through armor, through righteousness, through every justification she'd ever wrapped around the act of killing. Loot's voice died. The spear suddenly felt heavy. Wrong. The rider didn't speak. Didn't advance. The chain moved with casual precision. Not to strike, to mark. The tip touched her breastplate. Hellfire traced a line. Didn't burn through. Burned into. Loot felt it sink past metal, past skin, straight into whatever passed for her soul. Every kill rushed back. Every face. Every moment she'd felt that small thrill when the light left their eyes. The ones who ran. The ones who begged. The ones who just stood there, like the demon behind her, too terrified to even scream. She felt what they felt. All of them, at once. Loot dropped. Spear clattered against stone. Her wings spasmed. Sound left her throat, but it wasn't screaming. Screaming was too clean. This was the noise someone made when their own actions crushed them from the inside. The other exorcists circled, weapons raised, uncertain. Ghost Rider turned his head, slow, deliberate. Looked at each of them in turn. No one moved. He walked past Loot's twitching form, past the body she'd just made. His boots left scorched prints on broken concrete. The chain dragged behind him, scraping a line in the dust. At the end of the street, he stopped. Didn't look back. Just stood there, flames casting long shadows across the district. The message was simple. There are no clean hands here. The extermination continued. But quieter now. More careful. The exorcists who'd seen Loot fall moved differently. Checked their targets twice. Some even hesitated. By the time the retreat signal sounded, Hell had a new problem. Something was judging the judges. Hell had a PR problem. Charlie Morningstar stood in the hotel lobby, staring at the screen Vaggie had propped against the bar. The footage looped for the third time. Smoke. Fire. An exorcist crumpling mid-flight. Then that figure wreathed in flame chain, coiled at his side like a living thing. The news ticker scrolled beneath unknown entity attacks heaven's forces. Extermination interrupted. Threat level unknown. Vaggie crossed her arms. Her voice came out flat the way it always sounded when she braced for bad news. This changes everything. Charlie wanted to argue. Wanted to say that one incident wouldn't derail months of work, wouldn't make heaven forget that redemption was possible. But the word stuck. She thought about Sir Pentius ascending, about Adam falling, about how fragile their proof had been even before this. We don't know what happened, Charlie said. The sentence sounded weak even to her own ears. We know an exorcist went down. Vaggie pointed at the frozen frame. We know heaven's going to demand answers, and we know they're not going to believe no comment. The screen flickered, changed channels. Vox's logo filled the display sleek and sharp, and completely at odds with the chaos still smoking in the background footage. Across Pride Ring, in the tower that gleamed with stolen electricity and borrowed credibility, Vox leaned back in his chair and watched the same clip for the 20th time. Beautiful. He paused the feed on the exact moment the exorcist collapsed. Replayed it, slowed it down. The figure in leather barely moved, no theatrics, no speeches. Pure result. Valentino's voice drifted through the penthouse intercom, syrup slick and bored. You've been watching that for an hour. It's getting creepy even for you. Vox ignored him. He scrubbed forward through the footage again, analyzing angles, measuring response times. The other exorcists had backed off. Not retreated, backed off. There was a difference. Retreat was tactical. Backing off was fear. He opened a second screen. Started drafting the evening broadcast script. Isolated incident, he muttered. Fingers flying across the holographic keyboard. Equipment malfunction, unprecedented atmospheric conditions in Pride Ring. He paused, added another line. Heaven's investigating. Full transparency expected. None of it was true. All of it would sound convincing. Vox smiled at his reflection in the darkened monitor. Control wasn't about stopping the story. Control was about shaping which version people remembered. Charlie turned away from the screen. Angel dust sprawled across one of the couches, pretending to file his nails, while clearly listening to every word. Husk polished glasses behind the bar, with mechanical precision, his usual deflection when conversations got heavy. We should make a statement, Charlie said, before someone else does. Vaggie shook her head. And say what? Please don't blame us for the mysterious fire demon who just humiliated Heaven's army. We don't even know if he's connected to hell. Charlie heard the desperation creeping into her voice. Hated it. He could be... What? Angel cut in, finally abandoning his manicure. A concerned citizen. Some rando who thought Extermination Day needed a referee. Charlie opened her mouth, closed it. The truth was, she had no idea what she'd seen. The figure in the footage moved with purpose, certainty. Like he belonged there in a way that bypassed all the usual rules about territory and jurisdiction and whose authority mattered where. The hotel's front door slammed open. Lucifer strolled in, hands in his pockets, expression carefully neutral in that way that meant he'd already heard everything and decided how he felt about it hours ago. Dad? Charlie straightened. Have you seen the news? Fielded 17 calls from panicked overlords. Watched Heaven's spokesperson stammer through 5 different explanations in 10 minutes. Lucifer examined his cane, turning it idly. Yeah, I'm caught up. And nothing? He met her eyes. Someone put an exorcist on the ground. Heaven's embarrassed. Hell's confused. You're worried it'll blow back on your project. He tapped the cane once against the floor. Am I missing anything? Charlie recognized the tightness in her jaw. You don't think this is serious? I think, Lucifer said very carefully, that if Heaven panics, they won't punish whoever did this. They'll erase anyone they think might be a threat, starting with a hotel that's already questioning their authority. The lobby went quiet. Vaggy's wings rustled. Angel stopped pretending to be disinterested. Even Husk set down the glass he'd been polishing for the last 5 minutes. Charlie forced herself to breathe, to think past the spike of fear that her father's words triggered. "So we do nothing. We," Lucifer corrected, "keep our heads down. We don't make statements. We don't pick sides. We let heaven, and whoever this is, sort out their own mess while we focus on proving redemption works." "That's not strategic." Lucifer's smile didn't reach his eyes. "No, it's survival. And right now, that's what you need." He left before Charlie could respond. The door swung shut with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than the slam from his entrance. Vox finished the script 20 minutes before airtime, sent it to his producer, adjusted his tie in the mirror, and practiced his concerned but confident expression until it looked natural. The broadcast went live at 8. "Good evening, Pride Ring. I'm Vox. And yes, we're all talking about the same thing." He leaned forward slightly, the angle calculated to project both authority and accessibility. Today's extermination saw an unprecedented event. An unknown entity interfered with Heaven's operations, resulting in 1 injured exorcist and widespread confusion. He paused. Let the weight of unknown entity settle. "Now I know what you're thinking. Is this a threat? Is Hell under attack? Should we be worried?" Vox shook his head, expression shifting to reassuring. "Here's what we know. The entity acted alone, targeted a single exorcist, then vanished. No demands, no manifesto, no follow-up." Another pause. He'd practiced this part 6 times. "Sounds to me like someone with a grudge settled a personal score. Dramatic cure. Dangerous to the general population." He spread his hands. "Zero evidence. Heaven's already investigating. We'll have answers soon." He smiled. The smile that had sold 1,000 products and twice as many lies. "In the meantime, remember, we control the narrative. Don't let fear control you. Stay informed. Stay safe." This is Vox, keeping you connected. The camera light blinked off. Vox sat back satisfied. The first draft of history was written. Now he just had to make sure it was the version that stuck. Charlie watched the broadcast from the lobby. Her stomach twisted with every smooth reassurance, every calculated deflection. "He's good," Angel said quietly. "Lying bastard's really good." Vaggy turned off the screen. "He's setting the frame, making it about fear management instead of what actually happened." "What did happen?" Charlie looked at her girlfriend. "Really?" Vaggy's expression darkened. Shadows moved behind her eyes, old memories she rarely talked about. "I don't know. But whoever that was..." She trailed off, started again. "He looked at that exorcist the way I used to look at sinners before I fell. Like he knew exactly what she'd done and was making her pay for it." "That's not justice," Charlie said. "No." Vaggy's voice went soft. "It's judgment." Charlie wanted to argue. Wanted to defend the principles she'd built her entire project around. Second chances. Redemption. The belief that anyone could change if given the opportunity. But the image of the exorcist collapsing kept replaying in her mind. The way the figure had simply stood there afterwards, flames casting long shadows, completely unconcerned with explanation or justification. That wasn't someone offering chances. That was someone delivering verdicts. Miles away, in a district most of Hell, avoided even on good days, another scavenger worked through the wreckage, left by extermination. A demon crouched behind rubble. Young. Opportunistic. The kind who saw chaos as cover and dead bodies as convenience. He'd waited until the exorcists retreated, then started looting. Valuables, identification, anything he could sell or leverage. He'd gotten cocky. Started bragging to his crew about the scores he'd made during the attack. About the sinners too scared to fight back the ones who'd practically handed over their belongings while angels circled overhead. About the one he'd finished off himself while everyone was distracted. The demon laughed, counted his take, made plans for next extermination. The temperature dropped. He looked up. Flames reflected in his eyes. The scream that followed was brief. By the time anyone thought to investigate, they found only scorched pavement and a survivor sitting against a wall whole but shattered, staring at nothing and whispering the same phrase over and over. He knew. The reports reached Vox's desk by midnight. Third-hand accounts, rumors, the kind of street-level noise his network usually filtered out. He read them anyway. Read about the survivor who couldn't stop shaking. About the marks on the ground that looked like chain links burned into concrete. About how every witness described the same detail flames that burned cold instead of hot. Vox deleted the reports. Sent a memo to his producers. No coverage of unverified incidents. Focus on official extermination statistics. But he kept one copy, printed it, filed it in a locked drawer. The narrative could always be adjusted later, if needed. Charlie couldn't sleep. She stood at the hotel window, watching Pride Ring's perpetual glow, thinking about justice and judgment and the difference between them. Somewhere out there, someone was acting without permission, without oversight. Without the checks and balances she'd spent months trying to convince heaven to respect. And part of her, the part she didn't want to examine too closely, wondered if that was exactly what hell needed. The thought terrified her more than the footage had. Vagji found her there an hour later, wrapped an arm around her shoulders. They stood together in silence, watching the city burn at its usual low simmer. "What do we do?" Charlie finally asked. "We keep going." Vaggi's grip tightened slightly. "We prove redemption works. We show heaven and hell and whoever the hell that was that there's another way. And if he comes back..." Vaggi was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd fought on both sides and trusted neither completely. "Then we hope we're not what he's looking for." Across town in Vox Tech Tower's penthouse, Vox reviewed tomorrow's programming slate and smiled. He had 24 hours of coverage planned. Expert panels, witness interviews carefully vetted, poll results showing that 73% of Hell's population understood the situation and trusted official explanations. The numbers weren't real. The polls weren't random. The experts were on payroll, but they'd shaped the conversation. And conversation shaped reality. Vox leaned back in his chair, finger-steepled screen face reflecting the city lights. "Relax," he murmured to the empty room, practicing the line he'd use tomorrow. "We're in control of the story." Outside, somewhere in Pride Ring's endless dark flames moved through streets that should have been empty, leaving marks nobody could explain, and finding sinners nobody would miss. Heaven had a leadership problem. Lute stood in the assembly hall wings, folded tight against her back, and listened to the third contradictory briefing in as many hours. The speaker, some administrative angel, whose name she'd never bothered learning, droned on about protocol adjustments and operational continuity. Adam was dead. Nobody said it directly. The briefing used phrases like command transition and temporary restructuring, as if calling it something else would make the reality less raw. Lute's hands curled into fists. She could still hear Adam's voice in her head. Brash, confident, certain that divine mandate made them untouchable. Then Nifty had put a blade through his chest and proved otherwise. The speaker concluded with standard reassurances. Order would be maintained. Authority remained absolute. The next extermination would proceed as scheduled. Lute waited until the hall emptied before approaching the podium. "We're doing nothing." Her voice came out harder than intended. "Someone killed Adam, and we're talking about schedules." The administrator adjusted his robes. "Lieutenant Grief is not grief." Lute cut him off. "Tactical assessment. Adam died because hell stopped fearing us. Because they think redemption gives them leverage. Because we let them believe there are limits to divine justice." The angel's expression shifted to cautious. "What are you suggesting?" Correction. Lute's wings spread slightly. Immediate and overwhelming. Show them that Adam's death changes nothing about our authority. The council is still reviewing. The council is afraid. Lute stepped closer. I'm not. Give me authorization, and I'll restore order myself. The administrator studied her. Lute held his gaze unwavering. Finally, he nodded once. Discretionary operations, he said quietly. Limited scope. Keep it contained. Lute smiled. It wasn't a kind expression. Charlie sat in the hotel office trying to focus on paperwork that suddenly felt irrelevant. Guest intake forms. Redemption progress charts. Evidence that maybe possibly change was achievable. All of it built on the assumption that heaven would acknowledge progress when they saw it. Adam's death had shattered that assumption. Vaggie entered without knocking. Her face carried the look that meant bad news incoming. Extermination activity, she said. Off schedule. 3 districts so far. Charlie's pen stopped mid-signature. They can't do that. There are protocols, agreements, which died with Adam. Vaggie crossed to the window. They're scared, Charlie. And scared authority doesn't negotiate. It demonstrates. Charlie wanted to argue. Wanted to believe that heaven operated on principle, not fear. But she remembered watching Sir Pentius ascend. Remembered the silence that followed. Not celebration, not acceptance. Just uncertainty. And uncertainty in power was dangerous. How bad? Charlie asked. Vaggie's silence was answer enough.
Nah.
Lute led the formation herself this time. 6 exorcists, all veterans, all comfortable with flexibility and target assessment. They descended on a district that intelligence flagged as reform adjacent. Sinners who attended support groups, who claimed they wanted to change, who thought regret could erase their crimes. The first target tried to run. Didn't even fight back. Just fled like that made a difference. Lute's spear found flesh with practiced efficiency. No hesitation. No second guessing. This was correction. This was necessary. The second target actually attempted diplomacy. Started stammering about rehabilitation and second chances and how they'd been attending sessions at that hotel. The sentence ended in a gurgle. By the 4th district, word had spread. Sinners locked themselves indoors. The streets emptied faster than during regular exterminations. Fear rippled through Pride Ring like a contagion. Good. Let them understand that divine authority didn't require justification. One of her squad newer recruits, still green around the edges, hesitated over a target. Lieutenant, this one's not fighting. Doesn't match the profile. They're here, Lute said flatly. That's profile enough. The recruit's hesitation lasted another 3 seconds. Then her blade descended. Lute nodded approval and moved to the next sector. In Vox Tech Tower, Vox watched feeds from 8 cameras simultaneously. His processors worked overtime, cataloging every angle, every death, every moment of panic. This was excellent content. He drafted 3 different headlines, testing which framing generated maximum engagement. Heaven responds to threat, polled well with the law and order demographic. Extermination escalates, captured the doom scrollers. Your neighborhood safe or target drove clicks through anxiety. He'd run all 3. Different audiences, different angles, same underlying message: stay tuned to Vox Tech for survival critical information. Valentino's voice crackled through the intercom again. You're enjoying this way too much. I'm enjoying good business, Vox corrected. Fear sells, and heaven just handed us premium-grade product. He pulled up demographic data. Cross-referenced viewership with location tracking. Started mapping which districts would tune in most desperately for updates on exorcist movements. Targeted advertising had never been easier. The temperature shift happened between the 4th and 5th kill. Lute registered it instantly. Not hell's ambient heat. Something colder. Something that made her wings itch with memories she'd been trying to suppress. She signaled the formation to hold position, scanned the surroundings. Empty streets, abandoned buildings. Nothing obviously out of place. Then she saw him, end of the avenue, standing exactly where sight lines converged. Leather and flame and that skull that shouldn't exist but did anyway. Her squad noticed. Weapons came up. Uncertain shuffling. Someone whispered a prayer that sounded more like fear than faith. Lute forced authority into her voice. Hold formation. It's one entity. We have numbers. The figure rider, whatever it was, stood utterly still. Fire reflected off broken windows, cast long shadows that seemed deeper than natural darkness. He wasn't blocking their path, wasn't advancing, just there, waiting. For what? One of her exorcists, the veteran, the one who'd served 3 full campaigns, broke formation. Not fleeing, moving forward, spear raised, aggressive stance. Stand down, Lute ordered. The veteran ignored her. Time someone taught this thing about divine authority. She charged, got 3 steps before the chain moved. It didn't lash out, didn't strike, just extended, wrapped, touched. The veteran collapsed mid-stride, hit pavement hard. Her scream started low and built until it cracked something in the air itself. Lute knew that sound. Had made it herself days ago. The rider stood over the fallen angel. Fire outlined his silhouette. He wasn't looking at the victim. He was looking at Lute, at the formation, at each of them in turn. The message was clear without words. This one earned it. Any of you want to test which side of the line you're on? Lute's grip tightened on her spear. Every tactical instinct screamed at her to attack, to prove heaven's authority couldn't be questioned by some nameless entity from nowhere. But she'd already learned what that cost. She raised one hand. Formation. Withdraw. The retreat wasn't panicked, wasn't flight, but it was retreat nonetheless. Behind them, the veteran continued to scream. The sound faded with distance, but never quite disappeared. Lucifer stood on his balcony, watching smoke rise from 3 districts simultaneously. His expression remained carefully neutral. Bored even. But his fingers drummed once against the railing, a tell only those who knew him well would recognize. Charlie found him there an hour after sunset. They're escalating, she said, no preamble. Heaven's not investigating, they're retaliating. Against who? Lucifer didn't turn. Against what they don't even know, what they're dealing with. Does it matter? Sinners are dying. Sinners are always dying. Lucifer finally looked at her. That's what happens when you build a system on punishment and call it justice. When heaven panics, it doesn't pray, it cleans. Charlie heard the resignation in his voice. Hated it. So we do nothing. We, Lucifer said carefully, recognize that this isn't our fight. That entity, whatever it is, isn't asking for our help, isn't asking for anything. And heaven's response is exactly what happens when authority realizes it might not be absolute. People are scared. Good. Lucifer's tone went sharp. Maybe scared enough to actually change instead of just talking about it. Your hotel preaches redemption, but nobody takes it seriously until they're looking at consequences they can't spin away. He left her there, alone with the smoke and the distant sounds of panic and the terrible understanding that her father might be right. Lute made it back to heaven's staging ground before her hand stopped shaking. Not from fear, from rage so tightly controlled it vibrated through her entire frame. The veteran was recovered an hour later, physically intact, mentally elsewhere. She stared at nothing, responded to nothing. When medics tried to move her, she flinched away from their touch like it burned. The report used clinical language. Severe psychological trauma. Recommended indefinite leave. Prognosis uncertain. Lute filed the report and immediately drafted another operation proposal. The administrator, who'd authorized discretion, found her in the command center at midnight. Lieutenant, perhaps it's time to reassess. We lost one angel, Lute interrupted. Against an unknown threat, acceptable casualties. She's not dead, she's neutralized. Same result. Lute pulled up tactical maps. We need to expand operations, hit harder, broader targeting parameters. Show that whatever this thing is, it can't protect them all. The administrator's hesitation was visible. The council wanted restraint. The council wants results. Lute met his eyes. I'll deliver both. Authorization. The silence stretched. Then quietly, discretion remains authorized. Lute smiled again. That same smile that held no warmth. Only purpose. In Pride Ring, word spread through the usual channels. Sinners who'd been considering the hotel suddenly reconsidered. Better to stay invisible than to associate with anything that might attract attention. Charlie's phone rang 6 times in 1 hour. Every call the same pattern. Nervous voices, apologies. Maybe later when things calm down. She stopped answering after the 4th cancellation. Angel found her in the lobby staring at the empty guest ledger. Hey. He sat beside her. Didn't touch. Just present. This ain't your fault. Isn't it? Charlie's voice came out hollow. I pushed for recognition. Proved redemption was possible. And now heaven's terrified that hell might actually change. So they're killing people to prevent change. Angel shook his head. That's on them toots, not you. Charlie wanted to believe that. But the cancellations kept coming, and the smoke kept rising. And somewhere out there, someone was delivering judgment without asking permission or caring about collateral damage. She'd built everything on the belief that change was possible through dialogue and proof and hope. But what happened? Happened when the system you were trying to change decided you were the threat. Lute stood at the edge of the heaven's observation deck, looking down at hell's lights, planning her next operation. Her next demonstration of authority. Behind her, someone cleared their throat. Another administrator. Higher rank this time. New directive from the council, Bess, he said, regarding discretionary operations. Lute turned, pulling authorization, expanding it. He handed her a sealed order. Revised parameters. Broader target identification, increased operational freedom. Lute opened the seal. Read the order twice to make sure she understood correctly. The directive didn't say stop. It said authorized discretion. Every limitation had been stripped away. Every guideline made optional. Every restraint removed in favor of operational judgment. Heaven had just given her permission to rewrite the rules of engagement. She looked back down at Pride Ring. At the districts where that entity had interfered. At the areas where sinners thought redemption might save them. When do we start? She asked. Immediately. Lute's smile widened. This time it reached her eyes. Far below in streets that should have been celebrating survival, a different kind of fear settled over hell. Not the fear of extermination. That was known. Scheduled. Survivable if you were smart or lucky. This was the fear of watching your executioner stop counting bodies and start measuring sins. And somewhere in the smoke and darkness, flames moved with patient certainty, not stopping the violence, just making sure nobody got away with enjoying it. The hotel was bleeding guests. Charlie sat in her office, surrounded by paperwork that represented months of effort, now collapsing in real time. Cancellation notices. Refund requests. Polite letters that all said the same thing in different words, too risky right now. She'd lost 12 potential residents in 3 days. Vaggie entered with another envelope. Set it on the desk without comment. The return address belonged to a sinner who'd been scheduled to arrive next week. Past tense. That's 15, Vaggie said quietly. Charlie didn't look up. Anyone actually staying? Angel, Husk, Nifty. Vaggie paused. The ones who literally have nowhere else to go. The sentence landed like a verdict. Charlie had built her entire project on hope and proof, and the belief that change was achievable. But hope didn't pay for upkeep. Proof didn't matter when heaven ramped up exterminations and hell decided visibility meant target. Her phone buzzed. Another message from her publicist, one of the few who hadn't dropped her yet. The text was clinical Vox Tech, running third segment tonight. Narrative control slipping. Need response or pivot strategy. Asterisk. Charlie deleted it. She had no response. No strategy. Just the slow realization that idealism required infrastructure, and infrastructure required resources she no longer had. A knock interrupted her spiral. Sharp. Professional. "Come in," Charlie called, expecting another cancellation delivery. The demon who entered wore an expensive suit and carried a briefcase that gleamed with the kind of polish that spoke of old money and older contracts. His smile was practiced. Comfortable. "Miss Morningstar, I am Graves, legal representation for the Collective Security Initiative." He offered a business card embossed with symbols Charlie recognized as legitimacy markers in Hell's bureaucracy. "I believe we can help each other." Graves spread documents across her desk. With the precision of someone who'd done this presentation 1,000 times. "The situation is straightforward, Bisem." "That's straightforward," he said. "Your project faces existential threat, heaven's escalation, media hostility, resource depletion." He tapped each phrase with a manicured claw. "We offer protection, guaranteed security, sufficient funding to maintain operations through the current crisis." Charlie scanned the first page. The language was dense, but not incomprehensible. Standard contract framework, terms and conditions, arbitration clauses. "In exchange for what?" she asked. "Partnership. We handle external pressures. You focus on redemption." Graves flipped to a marked section. "The collective has resources heaven respects. Connections hell acknowledges. Your hotel becomes untouchable. Your residents receive guaranteed protection during exterminations." It sounded too good. Charlie knew that. But she also knew the hotel had maybe 2 weeks before she couldn't make payroll. Before the building itself became a liability, nobody wanted associated with their name. Vaggie appeared in the doorway. Her expression went hard the moment she saw Graves. "Charlie, a word?" They stepped into the hallway. Vaggie kept her voice low but urgent. "You're not seriously considering this." "I'm considering keeping the hotel open." Charlie rubbed her temples. "We're dying, Vaggie. Slowly, but definitely. This might buy us time to prove redemption works before we collapse completely. Contracts in hell don't buy time. They buy souls." He didn't mention, "because it's in the fine print." Vaggie's wings flared slightly. "There's always fine print. Always a clause that sounds reasonable until it owns you." Charlie wanted to argue. Wanted to believe this was different. But exhaustion made the words heavy. What choice do we have? Let everything we've built fall apart, prove heaven right, that redemption was never viable. Vaggie's jaw tightened. She didn't answer, because they both knew there wasn't a clean option left. Charlie returned to the office. Graves waited patiently, contract still open to the signature page. "I need to review the full terms," Charlie said. "Of course." Graves produced a secondary document, thicker, more detailed. "Standard protection framework. Our organization assumes operational security. You maintain autonomy over redemption methodology. We simply ensure you have the space and resources to succeed." Charlie read and read again. The language was circular in places, references to subsections that referenced other subsections. But the core seemed legitimate. Protection, funding, autonomy, except there, buried in paragraph 7 of the third addendum, a clause about aligned interests and mutual obligation. Vague enough to mean anything, specific enough to be binding. "What does this mean?" Charlie pointed to the passage. Graves barely glanced at it. "Standard cooperation clause. Ensures both parties act in good faith. You run the hotel ethically. We provide support proportionally. Basic reciprocity. The explanation sounded reasonable. Charlie hated that it sounded reasonable. And if we disagree on what aligned interests means, arbitration. Graves tapped another section. Neutral third party, completely standard for hell contracts, protects both sides from abuse. Charlie felt Vaggy's presence behind her. Silent disapproval radiating like heat. But she also felt the weight of 15 cancellations, of Heaven's surveillance, of Vox's nightly broadcasts chipping away at everything she'd tried to build. "I need 24 hours to decide," Charlie said. Graves' smile never wavered. "Of course, though I should mention the collective's protection begins immediately upon signing. Every hour without coverage is another hour. Heaven could decide the hotel represents an unacceptable risk." The implicit threat was delicate, professional, devastating. Charlie looked at the contract. At the signature line, at the future where her hotel might survive versus the future where it definitely wouldn't. She picked up the pen. Vaggy's hand caught her wrist. "Charlie, please, what else am I supposed to do?" The words came out sharper than intended. "Watch everything fail, because I was too proud to accept help. This isn't help. It's a chance." Charlie pulled free gently. "Maybe the only one we get." She signed. The ink settled into the paper with a finality that felt heavier than it should. Graves collected the documents with practiced efficiency. Produced a copy for Charlie's records. "Protection initiates immediately," he said. "You'll notice reduced external pressure within 48 hours. Funding transfers will begin next week. Welcome to the collective, Miss Morningstar." He left. Taking the signed contract with him, Charlie sat in the sudden quiet staring at her copy of the agreement. The words blurred slightly. Probably exhaustion. Definitely not regret. Vaggy stood by the window. Wouldn't look at her. "I had to," Charlie said to the silence. Vaggy's response was barely audible. "I know." 3 districts away, in an office that smelled of leather and old paper, Graves delivered the signed contract to his employer. An overlord whose name appeared on no public registers, but whose influence threaded through half of Pride Ring's power structure. The overlord, they called him Slate, in the few circles that acknowledged his existence, examined the signature. Smiled. "Perfect penmanship," he murmured. "So eager, so desperate, so convinced she's still in control." Graves waited. He'd seen this before. Idealists signing away leverage they didn't understand they had. Slate filed the contract in a vault that contained hundreds like it. Each one a soul thinking they'd negotiated. Each one learning too late what aligned interests actually cost. "Begin phase 2, Slate said. "Let her feel secure for exactly 1 week. Then introduce the first compliance requirement." The change was subtle at first. Heaven's patrols didn't decrease, but they stopped circling the hotel quite so obviously. Vox's coverage shifted from hostile to dismissive, still negative, but no longer obsessive. Charlie told herself it was working. The protection was real. She'd made the right choice. Then the first requirement arrived. A polite letter from the collective. Requesting, not demanding requesting, that the hotel provide quarterly reports on resident progress. Standard accountability. Completely reasonable for investors to expect transparency. Charlie drafted the first report. Felt the weight of eyes she couldn't see reading over her shoulder. The second requirement came a week later. A suggestion that certain residents might benefit from external counseling services provided by collective-approved therapists. Optional, of course, but framed as best practice. Charlie noticed the residents who declined the services started receiving less favorable terms for continued housing. By the 3rd week, she understood what she'd signed. Not protection, supervision. The collective didn't care about redemption. They cared about access. About having their fingers in Pride Ring's only hotel, claiming to offer salvation. Every report she filed gave them data. Every resident who accepted their services gave them leverage. The contract wasn't helping her project. It was consuming it from the inside. Vaggie found Charlie in the office at 2 in the morning, surrounded by paperwork, trying to find a loophole that didn't exist. "There has to be a way out," Charlie said. "Contracts have terms, limits, something. Not in hell." Vaggie sat beside her. "Here contracts are perfect. That's why they're so dangerous." Charlie wanted to scream, wanted to burn the agreement and pretend it never happened. But the ink was dry. The signature was binding, and somewhere in that vault, Slate was probably smiling. The temperature dropped at 3 a.m. Charlie noticed it first. Not hell's usual heat. Something colder. Something that made the hair on her arms stand despite the oppressive warmth outside. She looked up from the contract she'd been dissecting for the 100th time. He stood in her office doorway. Flames outlined his silhouette. Leather jacket worn like armor. Skull reflecting the dim desk lamp with hollow sockets that somehow still saw everything. Charlie's first instinct was to reach for something, anything to defend herself. But her hand froze halfway to the letter opener. Ghost Rider didn't move, didn't advance, just stood there with that chain coiled loose at his side. His gaze, if empty sockets could be called gaze, dropped to the contract on her desk. Then lifted back to Charlie. She tried to speak, managed. It wasn't. The rider raised one hand. Not threatening, almost stopping her. Then he turned, walked past her office, down the hallway toward the front entrance. Charlie followed without deciding to. Something in his movement demanded witness. He stopped in the lobby, stood perfectly still, waiting. The front door opened. Slate entered, still wearing that professional smile, still carrying that briefcase of binding agreements. "Miss Morningstar, He saw the rider. The smile died. Slate's survival instincts were honed from decades of navigating hell's power structures. He assessed threats instantly, calculated odds, made strategic decisions. Every calculation told him to run. He stood frozen instead. Because something about the figure in front of him bypassed strategy and went straight to primal recognition. This wasn't negotiable. Ghost Rider took one step forward. The chain moved. Didn't strike, just extended. The tip touched Slate's chest with the delicacy of a surgeon locating a tumor. Slate's eyes went wide, then wider. His briefcase dropped. Papers scattered. Every contract he'd ever written played behind his eyes. Every desperate signature, every loophole he'd exploited. Every soul he'd convinced they were making a choice when they were really just choosing which chain to wear. He felt what they felt. Every single one. The slow realization, the creeping horror, the understanding that they'd been owned the moment they'd believed his smile. Slate dropped to his knees. Sound left his throat not screaming, but something worse. The noise of someone watching their entire career, revealed as systematic predation. The rider stood over him, silent, patient. Charlie watched from the hallway. Every instinct screamed to intervene, to stop this, to prove she still believed in second chances. But another part of her, the part that had spent 3 weeks watching her project become someone else's puppet, stayed quiet. Ghost Rider looked at Slate, then at the scattered contracts, then back at Slate. The message was wordless, but clear: release them. Slate's hands shook as he gathered papers. Found Charlie's contract among the pile, stared at it like it was a snake. Void, he whispered. Null. Fraud of... His voice broke, started again. Mutual aligned interests, never Jesus fuck. He scrawled something across the signature page. The ink glowed briefly, then faded. The contract curled at the edges, turned to ash. Slate collapsed. The rider stepped back, turned toward the door. Charlie found her voice. Wait. The rider paused, didn't look back. Why? The question came out raw. Why help you don't, you're not? He glanced over his shoulder. For just a moment, those hollow sockets met her eyes. No judgment there, not for her. Just acknowledgement that she'd signed under duress. That desperation wasn't consent, that Slate had built an empire on the difference. Then he left, flames trailing in his wake, chains scraping one last mark across the threshold before vanishing into Pride Ring's perpetual night. Charlie stood in the lobby, surrounded by ash, watching Slate curl into a ball and whimper. She didn't feel victory, didn't feel relief, just the cold understanding that she'd almost sold her project's soul and only avoided it because someone had been willing to terrify a predator into releasing his prey. That wasn't redemption, that was judgment. And she still didn't know how to reconcile the difference. By morning, the story had leaked. Vox's network ran it at 7. Hazbin Hotel and Soul Trade scandal. Footage of Slate being carried out by medical personnel. Speculation about what Charlie had signed. Expert panels debating whether the Princess of Hell had compromised her entire project. The contract being voided didn't matter to the narrative. The signing did. Charlie watched the coverage from her office. Each new headline, another nail. Hotel owner desperate enough to deal with soul traders. Redemption project, noble ideal, or elaborate con. Charlie Morningstar, savior or opportunist. Angel found her there at noon. Set down a mug of something that smelled like coffee, but probably wasn't. For what it's worth, he said, you didn't know. That bastard was professional. I should have known. Charlie's voice felt distant. I'm supposed to be proving redemption works. Instead, I proved I'm exactly what they think I am. Desperate, naive, dangerous. You're also the only person in hell actually trying. Angel leaned against the desk. That's got to count for something. Charlie wanted to believe that. But the coverage kept rolling. And somewhere in Vox Tech Tower, she knew Vox was smiling. Vox watched the engagement metrics climb. This was premium content. The Princess of Hell caught in a scandal that confirmed every suspicion about redemption being a scam. He scheduled 5 follow-up segments, booked guests who'd call for the hotel's closure, prepared polls asking whether Charlie should step down. The narrative was perfect, self-sustaining, profitable. He leaned back in his chair and practiced tomorrow's concerned citizen monologue. So this is what redemption costs, he murmured to his reflection, testing the line, adjusting the inflection. Souls, compromises, the very thing it claims to oppose. Beautiful. The city would eat it up. Angel Dust had learned to measure time in bruises, not the kind that showed. Valentino was too smart for that. The bruises came from hours standing in heels that weren't made for standing. From smiling until his face ached. From saying yes when every nerve screamed no, because the alternative was being reminded what breach of employment looked like in hell. He finished the 6th take of a scene that should have wrapped 3 takes ago. The director called cut. Angel peeled himself off the prop furniture and reached for the robe someone had left on a chair. Valentino's voice cut through the studio before Angel's fingers touched fabric. Leave it! Angel froze. Turned. Val stood in the doorway to his private office wings, spread just enough to fill the frame. That smile plastered across his face, the one that always preceded a shift in terms. We're adding to today's schedule, Valentino said. His tone carried the weight of a suggestion that wasn't. Client request, premium tier. You'll handle it personally? Angel's stomach dropped. Premium tier meant off books. Meant scenarios the main studio wouldn't touch. Meant crossing lines that even Hell's broadcasting standards considered questionable. Vali, the schedule's already adjusted. Valentino's smile never wavered. You're free now. Aren't you fortunate? The question wasn't really a question. Angel knew the script. Knew that pushing back meant Val would remind him gently, professionally, exactly whose name sat at the top of his employment papers. Whose empire fed and housed and protected him. Whose goodwill was the only thing standing between Angel and streets where nobody cared if you disappeared. Yeah, Angel heard himself say. Fortunate. The client arrived 20 minutes later. Angel didn't catch a name, didn't need to. Premium tier customers paid for discretion and got it. The shoot lasted 4 hours. Angel counted ceiling tiles, practiced multiplication tables, thought about literally anything except what was happening. When it ended, he found his clothes exactly where he'd left them, got dressed, walked out of the studio with mechanical precision. Valentino intercepted him in the hallway, handed him an envelope. Bonus for flexibility. Angel took it. The weight suggested cash, enough to cover rent for 2 months, enough to make saying no next time even harder. Appreciate the work ethic, Val said. His hand landed on Angel's shoulder, friendly, possessive. Knew I could count on you, Angel nodded. Couldn't find words that didn't taste like ash. He made it back to the hotel before the shaking started. Charlie found him in his room an hour later. She knocked, waited, knocked again. Angel, you missed dinner. Are you fine? The word came out too fast, too sharp. Just tired. Silence from the hallway. Then quietly, can I come in? Angel stared at the door, at the envelope on his nightstand, at the bruises that weren't visible but felt carved into his bones anyway. Not tonight, princess. More silence. Then footsteps retreating, slow, reluctant. Angel buried his face in his hands and tried to remember why he'd thought redemption was possible. When rent came due every month and Valentino had receipts proving Angel's soul was paid for. Valentino reviewed the day's numbers from his penthouse office. Revenue up 18%. Client satisfaction at 93. Efficiency metrics trending positive across all departments. The scandal with that hotel Charlie's little contract fiasco had created opportunity. Sinners who'd considered reformation suddenly remembered why staying on Val's good side mattered. His talent pool had expanded. His leverage had increased. Business was excellent. Vox's face materialized on the wall monitor. Saw your quarterly report? Impressive growth. Demand drives supply. Valentino lit a cigarette, blew smoke at the camera. When heaven gets aggressive and hell gets scared, people need distraction. Just make sure your distractions don't become liabilities. Vox's expression shifted to something approximating concern. That entity from the extermination still active, still unpredictable. Not my problem. Valentino waved dismissively. I run legitimate operations. Licensed, legal, everything by the book. There's the book, Vox said carefully. And then there's what actually happens in the studio. Valentino's wings flared slightly. My employees are contracted, compensated, protected. What they do is work. What I provide is opportunity. Nobody's forcing anyone. Vox didn't argue. Just logged off with a shrug that suggested he'd delivered the warning and considered his obligation fulfilled. Valentino returned to his reports. The opportunity line wasn't just spin. He genuinely believed it. Every signature was voluntary. Every renewal negotiated. The fact that his employees had no real alternatives wasn't his fault. That was just hell's economy. He'd built an empire on giving people exactly what they signed up for. If they didn't like the terms, they shouldn't have signed. Angel returned to work the next day because not returning wasn't an option. The shoot was standard, routine. The kind of thing he could do half asleep at this point. Valentino pulled him aside afterward. Another envelope. Another special request. Client from last time, Val explained. Very satisfied. Wants a follow-up. Premium rate again. Angel's mouth went dry. Val, wasn't in your standard agreement, correct? Valentino's tone stayed pleasant. That's why it's premium. That's why the compensation reflects the added flexibility. I don't want to want. Valentino repeated the word like it was foreign. Angel baby, we all do things we don't want. That's called employment. You think I want to deal with licensing boards and safety inspectors and talent who suddenly develop opinions about their workload? His smile sharpened. But we do what's necessary. What's professional? His hand landed on Angel's shoulder again. Heavier this time. You're one of my best. Don't make me reconsider that assessment. The threat was velvet-wrapped, but unmistakable. Angel had seen what happened to Talent Val reconsidered. Blacklisted, homeless, vulnerable in ways that made extermination look merciful. When? Angel asked. His voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. Tonight, 8 p.m., same setup. Valentino patted his shoulder. Knew you'd understand. That's why you're valuable. Charlie intercepted Angel in the hotel lobby at 7:30. He was dressed, ready, moving with the mechanical precision of someone going through motions they'd stopped questioning. Angel, wait. She stepped into his path. Are you okay? You've been working. He tried to move past. She didn't budge. This isn't... She struggled for words. You don't have to go. If something's wrong, if Valentino's... Charlie! Angel's tone came out harder than intended. Drop it. But, I said drop it. He finally met her eyes, saw the concern there, the genuine belief that care could fix things. You got your own problems. Your hotel's bleeding reputation and guests. Focus on that. Let me handle mine. He walked past her before she could respond. Hated himself for the look on her face. Hated Valentino more for making that look necessary. The client was waiting when Angel arrived at the studio. Same as before. Same setup. Same scenario that pushed every boundary Angel had spent decades building. Halfway through, something shifted. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 3 seconds. The studio lights flickered. Died. Emergency backups kicked in with red glow that turned everything the color of warnings nobody heeded. Valentino appeared from his office. Wings spread. Expressions cycling from irritation to confusion to something approaching alarm. What the? He stopped. Everyone stopped. The figure stood in the center of the studio. Flames outlined his form against emergency lighting. Leather. Skull. Chain coiled with patient menace. Angel recognized him from footage. From rumors. From the entity that had put an exorcist on the ground and made heaven flinch. Valentino recovered first. Smoothed his expression, adjusted his coat. This is private property. Licensed operations. You have no jurisdiction. The rider's head turned. Slow, deliberate, fixed on Valentino with hollow sockets that somehow still conveyed absolute focus. Val's next words died unspoken. The chain moved, not fast, not aggressive. Just extended with the certainty of something that had all the time in existence. The tip touched Valentino's chest, right above where his heart would be if he still had one. Fire traced a line. Didn't burn through fabric. Burned past it, past skin, past bone. Straight into whatever passed for Valentino's soul in the bureaucratic machinery that powered hell. Val's wings spasmed, his expression cracked. Every face rushed back. Not just the ones he remembered, the ones he'd forgotten. The ones he'd processed as inventory. Numbers on spreadsheets, talent contracted and compensated and completely replaceable. He saw them as people, felt what they felt when their autonomy became his revenue stream. When their boundaries became negotiable clauses. When their refusal became breach of employment. Every signature he'd collected. Every opportunity he'd provided. Every time he'd wrapped coercion in compensation and called it voluntary. They felt it. He felt them feel it. All of them. Simultaneously, forever. Valentino collapsed. Sound left his throat that wasn't quite screaming. More like the noise someone made when their entire business model revealed itself as systematic violation. The rider stepped back, turned toward Angel. Angel froze. Braced for judgment, for being complicit, for surviving by going along. The rider's gaze, if empty flame could be called gaze, held him for 3 seconds, then moved past. No condemnation, no absolution, just acknowledgement that survival under duress wasn't the same as choosing harm. The chain scraped once across the studio floor. The rider walked toward the exit, left Valentino writhing, left the client fled, left Angel standing in emergency lighting with a bruise that finally showed. The aftermath hit within hours. Valentino's network dissolved. Clients vanished. Associates distanced. The empire he'd built on plausible deniability crumbled the moment everyone realized he'd crossed lines that even hell considered negotiable. Not because Ghost Rider had killed him. Because he'd proven what everyone suspected, the legitimate facade was just facade. Angel returned to his room at the hotel. Found Charlie waiting in the hallway. She didn't ask questions, just stood when he approached. "I'm sorry," I'm sorry, she said quietly. "I should have." "You couldn't." Angel cut her off. Not unkind, just factual. That's not how it works. Contracts don't break because someone cares. Then how? Someone reminded Val what he'd been pretending not to notice. Angel stared at his hands. They'd stopped shaking. Hadn't realized when. That all his paperwork and licenses and legitimate operations were just, he searched for words, permission slips to do damage. Charlie looked like she wanted to argue, to defend the idea that systems could be fixed with good intentions. Angel saved her the trouble. "I'm still not free. The contract's still valid. But the infrastructure," he gestured vaguely toward where Valentino's empire was collapsing in real time. "That's gone, for now." "Is that enough?" Angel thought about ceiling tiles, about bruises that didn't show, about the difference between legal and ethical that he'd been living in for years. "It's more than yesterday." Valentino made it back to his penthouse on muscle memory and spite. His staff had already started deserting. Calls went unanswered. Partners renegotiated or withdrew entirely. He stared at his reflection in the darkened monitor, saw someone who'd built everything on the technicality that coercion with paperwork wasn't coercion. His phone buzzed. Message from Vox. "Told you to be careful." Valentino hurled the phone across the room. It shattered against marble that suddenly felt like evidence of empire built on exploitation he'd convinced himself was opportunity. He touched his chest where the chain had marked him. No wound visible, but he could still feel it. Would always feel it. The weight of every person he'd processed as product. Someone knocked. One of his few remaining associates. Nervous, sweating. "Boss, the licensing board called. They want to discuss..." The associate swallowed. "Irregularities." Valentino waved him off. Alone again, he slumped into his chair, stared at the city lights, at the districts where his brand had meant something. Past tense. His smile returned. Smaller, harder, built on spite rather than satisfaction. "You think this ends me?" he whispered to the empty room, to the entity that was probably gone, to himself. "I'm just one brand, one operation. You broke my infrastructure, didn't break the industry." Because that was true. His empire was collapsing. But demand remained. Supply would adjust. Someone else would fill the vacuum with slightly better paperwork and slightly smarter exploitation. Ghost Rider had judged him, had broken him, but hadn't saved anyone. Couldn't save anyone from a system designed to make damnation profitable. Charlie stood at her office window, watched smoke rise from Valentino's territory. Should have felt satisfaction. Progress. Victory. Felt only exhaustion. Angel was safer, temporarily, but his papers still bound him. The next Valentino was probably already drafting better terms. Learning from this one's mistakes, Vaggi entered, stood beside her. Neither spoke for a long moment. "Did it help?" Vaggi finally asked. "The judgment." Charlie thought about the question. About Slate. About Valentino. About systems that survived the people running them. "It proved something," she said slowly. "That hell's economy works because we pretend coercion is choice. And sometimes, she gestured toward the distant smoke, someone makes us stop pretending. Is that redemption? No. Charlie's voice was firm. That's just honesty. Redemption would be building something that doesn't need judgment to function ethically. She turned from the window, back to her desk, back to paperwork for a hotel that still barely existed. Building that wouldn't happen overnight, might not happen at all. But at least now, after contracts and exploitation and judgment delivered without mercy, Charlie understood what she was actually fighting. Not heaven's authority, not hell's systems. The comfortable lie that suffering with paperwork wasn't still suffering. Across Pride Ring in streets that never quite slept, flames moved with patient purpose. Not hunting, not crusading. Just existing as a reminder that some debts came due, whether the paperwork said otherwise or not. And in Vox Tech Tower, Vox watched footage of Valentino's collapse with clinical interest. Ran projections on how the market would adjust. Who would absorb his territory? What lessons could be extracted? He leaned back, screen flickering with data streams and stock tickers and the endless machinery of commerce that survived individual failures. Made a note for tomorrow's broadcast. Industry responds to isolated incident with renewed commitment to standards. Beautiful framing. Technically true, completely meaningless. The story would continue. Different players, same structure. And somewhere in the smoke and rubble, an entity made of judgment and hellfire moved on to the next sin that thought itself untouchable. Vox understood leverage better than most demons in hell. Not the crude kind threats, violence, territory disputes. The sophisticated kind. The kind that made people choose exactly what you wanted them to choose while believing they decided independently. He sat in Vox Tech's primary broadcast booth, reviewing tonight's programming slate. His producers had cued the usual lineup: entertainment, news, analysis, opinion segments designed to look like objective reporting, but tonight required something more surgical. The footage from Valentino's collapse had been circulating for 36 hours. Unfiltered, raw. The kind of content that made audiences uncomfortable because it suggested maybe, just maybe, some authorities weren't untouchable. Dangerous precedent. Vox pulled up demographic data, cross-referenced viewing patterns with location tracking, identified clusters where uncertainty was metastasizing into questions. Questions he needed answered before they spread. His finger hovered over the segment outline titled Threat Assessment, Unknown Entity Analysis. Perfect framing, clinical language, zero explicit calls for action. He pressed record. The broadcast opened with his standard intro. Professional, accessible. The face Pride Ring had learned to trust for information during uncertain times. Good evening. Before we begin tonight's programming, I want to address concerns many of you have raised. Vox leaned forward slightly, body language calibrated for sincerity. We've all seen the footage, the incidents, the pattern of disruption targeting established operations across multiple districts. He paused. Let the word disruption settle. Neutral, clinical, threatening without being explicit. Now I'm not here to tell you what to think. That's not my job. My job is to present information and let you, intelligent, capable citizens, make your own decisions. He spread his hands. But I am compelled to ask, when does self-defense become necessary? When does tolerance of disruption become complicity in chaos? Another pause. Longer. His expression shifted to concerned citizen rather than broadcaster. I'm seeing reports of neighborhoods made unsafe. Businesses destroyed. Sinners living in fear because something has decided our systems don't deserve respect. Vox shook his head. And heaven silent. Hell's leadership nowhere. We're on our own out there. He let that sink in. The isolation, the abandonment, the implication that action, any action, was justified self-preservation. So tonight I'm not telling anyone what to do. I'm simply asking how much disruption is too much. At what point do we collectively decide enough He paused once more. Think about it. Talk to your neighbors. Protect your communities however you see fit. The segment ended. Vox sat back, reviewed the recording. Perfect. Zero explicit incitement. Pure framing and implication. He sent it to air. Velvet burst into the control room 20 minutes after the broadcast aired. Her phone was already tracking engagement metrics. Engagements through the roof, she announced. Trending in 6 districts. Shares tripling every 10 minutes. She flicked through screens. And oh, this is perfect. People are organizing watch groups, community protection initiatives. All spontaneous, all grassroots. Vox allowed himself a small expression of satisfaction. Any violent incidents? Define violent. Velvet shrugged. Property damage in 3 locations. 2 sinners hospitalized. 1 unconfirmed fatality. But, and this is key, nobody's directly blaming us. They're blaming fear, uncertainty, concerned citizens acting on available information, which we provided, which we made accessible. Velvet's correction was automatic. We didn't create the fear. We reported on conditions that made fear rational. Huge difference. Vox nodded. The distinction mattered. Not legally, hell had flexible standards, but psychologically. If he believed he'd simply provided information, then whatever people did with that information was their responsibility. The phone on his desk buzzed. Producer, urgent tone. Boss, we've got a situation developing in District 7. Crowd forming, looking organized. Cameras are picking up. Static interrupted. Targeting suspected sympathizers of that hotel. The Redemption Project. Vox's screen flickered to life. Multiple feeds. A crowd, maybe 50 demons converging on a building. Chanting. Waving improvised weapons. The building's residents were visible through windows. Scared. Trapped. Perfect television. Get crew on site, Vox ordered. I want live coverage. Frame it as community response to systemic threat. Interviews with concerned citizens. Make sure we capture the human element. The producer hesitated. Boss, if this goes bad, then we report accurately on how fear drives people to desperate measures. We're journalists, not peacekeepers. Vox cut the connection. Pulled up the feeds himself. Charlie saw the coverage from the hotel lobby. The building on screen wasn't familiar at first. Then she recognized the balcony. The faded sign. That was where 3 former guests had relocated after canceling their reservations. Sinners who'd decided Hazbin was too visible, too dangerous, who'd thought anonymity was safer. Now a mob surrounded their building because someone had leaked their connection to the hotel. We have to... Charlie started toward the door. Lucifer's hand caught her shoulder. He'd materialized with his usual uncanny timing. No, he said quietly. You go out there, you confirm everything Vox is implying. That the hotel is connected to every disruption. That redemption is cover for chaos. But they're in danger because of us. They're in danger because someone decided fear was profitable. Lucifer's tone stayed flat. Going out there doesn't fix that. It just gives Vox better footage. Charlie stared at the screen. At the crowd. At the residents inside who were paying for her idealism with their safety. She hated that her father was right. Vox watched the feeds with clinical detachment. The crowd was growing. 30 to 70 in 15 minutes. His cameras captured every angle. The fear, the anger, the collective permission people gave each other to do things individually they'd never consider. His phone rang. Velvet. Ratings are nuclear, she said. Her voice carried excitement under professional calm. Every channel's picking up our feed. You're the primary source. This is brand-defining coverage. Any attribution? Vox asked. Anyone suggesting we provoked this? Couple of think pieces from fringe blogs. Nothing mainstream. The narratives holding spontaneous community response to legitimate security concerns. She paused. Though someone leaked footage of your broadcast with highlight reels of the riot synced to your talking points. That's correlation, not causation. Velvet finished his thought. You asked questions, you raised concerns, you never told anyone to do anything specific. The leak is just trying to manufacture controversy where none exists. Vox exhaled tension he hadn't realized he was holding. The distinction mattered. As long as his language remained implication rather than instruction, he was covered. Legally, morally, psychologically. What people chose to do with carefully framed information was their choice. The temperature in the broadcast booth dropped 40 degrees in 3 seconds. Vox's screens flickered. Not a power surge. Not a technical glitch. Something interfering at a level his equipment wasn't designed to register. He turned. The figure stood between him and the exit. Flames outlined bone. Leather absorbed light. The chain coiled with the patience of something that had waited centuries and could wait centuries more. Vox's first instinct was to run. His second was to reach for his emergency broadcast button. His third, the one that kicked in when survival overrode pride, was to stay perfectly still. Ghost Rider took one step forward. The movement displaced air that suddenly felt too thick to breathe. Vox started. Stopped. His usual deflections felt flimsy in the presence of something that didn't care about framing. I reported information, made observations. I never told anyone to. The chain moved, not to strike, to measure. The tip extended, touched Vox's screen face with the delicacy of someone checking if a circuit was live. Fire traced across his surface. Didn't burn the screen, burned past it. Into whatever passed for Vox's consciousness in the electronic architecture that housed his existence. Every broadcast rushed back, not just tonight's. Every segment, every carefully crafted implication, every time he'd framed information to nudge audiences toward conclusions he wouldn't say aloud. He saw the crowd, saw them act, saw the violence. But more than that, he felt the moment they decided. The specific phrases, the particular framing, the algorithmic push that made his content unavoidable in their feeds. He'd said he was just presenting information. The penance showed him the truth he'd been conducting an orchestra. Every word a note, every pause a cue. The violence wasn't spontaneous. It was composed, and he'd known. Every time he adjusted phrasing to avoid explicit liability, he'd known exactly what he was building toward. Vox collapsed. His screen face cracked with static. Not physically, psychologically. The firewall between journalist and insider shattered. He saw every consequence. Every person hurt by mobs he'd just asked questions into existence. Every time he'd hidden behind the passive voice and plausible deniability. The worst part wasn't the harm. It was the realization that he'd enjoyed it. The control. The power to move crowds without their knowledge. The ability to stay clean while others got blood on their hands at his suggestion. Sound left him that wasn't quite screaming. More like feedback. Like a system overloading with input it couldn't process. The writer stepped back, turned toward the broadcast equipment. His gaze empty fire that somehow still saw moved across screens, across cameras, across the machinery that turned suggestion into action. His hand moved. Chain scraped across the primary console. Not destruction. Mark. A reminder burned into metal and circuitry that some switches had consequences beyond plausible deniability. Then he turned. Walked toward the exit. Left Vox curled on the floor with his carefully constructed reality dismantled. The broadcast cut to technical difficulties. Every screen in Pride Ring that carried Vox Tech feed went to static simultaneously. Not permanently, just long enough to break the momentum. to interrupt the narrative flow, to create a gap where the spell of carefully crafted outrage could dissipate. The crowd in District 7 hesitated. Without the continuous feed reinforcing their certainty, doubt crept in. Questions. Were they really defending their community, or were they following cues they'd mistaken for their own thoughts? By the time the feed restored, the crowd had begun dispersing. Not because they'd been stopped, because the psychological infrastructure supporting their anger had been temporarily disrupted. Vox's producers scrambled to restore normal programming, found their boss non-responsive, staring at something nobody else could see. Charlie watched the screens flicker back to life. The crowd was leaving. The trapped residents were safe, shaken but unharmed. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the cold realization that this was temporary. Vox would recover. The machinery would rebuild. Next time, the framing would be subtler. The implications more careful, because Ghost Rider had proven Vox guilty, but hadn't changed the fact that Hell's entire economy ran on profitable manipulation. "It didn't fix anything," she said to the empty lobby. Lucifer's voice drifted from the doorway. "No, it just made one person stop pretending he was innocent." Velvet found Vox in the booth an hour later. He was functional, upright, but something in his expression had fractured. "Boss, what happened? Did he?" "He showed me the math." Vox's voice came out mechanical, distant. "The exact correlation between my word choice and crowd behavior. The algorithmic feedback loops. The moment people made decisions I'd framed as their own. But that's not we never explicitly. I know what we explicitly did." Vox cut her off. "And I know what we actually did. Those aren't the same thing. They've never been the same thing." Velvet backed toward the door. This version of Vox's uncertain questioning fractured was more disturbing than any violence could have been. "Should I cancel tomorrow's broadcast?" she asked. Vox stared at his hands, at the screens, at the equipment that had made him Hell's most influential voice. "No," he said finally. "We keep broadcasting, keep providing information, keep—" He trailed off, started again. "I just need to figure out how to present information without conducting symphonies of violence I pretend not to hear." Velvet left, uncertain what was more frightening, Vox before the judgment or Vox trying to operate after it. 3 hours later, Vox Tech aired an unprecedented segment. Vox appeared on screen. No makeup, no perfect lighting, just him and a camera. "I want to address tonight's incident in District 7. He paused. No calculated pause. Genuine hesitation. "I've spent my career saying I just provide information. That what audiences do with that information is their choice, their responsibility." Another pause. Longer. "I'm not sure I believe that anymore. I'm not sure I ever really believed it." He met the camera. "Words have direction. Framing has momentum. When I ask how much is too much, I'm not just asking. I'm suggesting an answer. And I've known that. Always known that." He exhaled. "I don't have solutions tonight. I don't have new promises about objectivity or responsibility. I just have the admission that I've been hiding behind technicalities while very aware of what I was actually doing." The broadcast ended there. No call to action, no redemption arc, just acknowledgement. In Vox Tech Tower's penthouse, Vox sat in darkness. Screens reflected his face from a dozen angles, each one showing someone who'd spent years convinced his hands were clean because he'd never touched the trigger. The entity hadn't destroyed his career, hadn't shut down his network, hadn't even stopped him from broadcasting. It had done something worse, made him watch himself with clarity he couldn't unsee. His phone buzzed. Message from an unknown number. Just coordinates. A location in the Pride Ring wasteland where nothing broadcast and fewer questions got asked. Vox stared at the coordinates, recognized them as belonging to a known trafficking operation, one his investigations team had documented months ago. One he'd shelved because the story would offend too many advertisers. He pulled up the file, read through evidence, victim testimonies, infrastructure details. Then he opened a new project folder, started drafting a story he couldn't hide behind. One that would cost him sponsors, partnerships, maybe his empire. Because if he was going to keep broadcasting, he needed to figure out how to do it without conducting atrocities he'd pretend were spontaneous. This wasn't redemption. Wasn't even the beginning of redemption. But it was the first time he'd looked at his platform and asked whose hands were really on the controls. Across Pride Ring and streets where riots had almost ignited demons returned to their homes, some confused, some angry at their own confusion. Most just exhausted by the constant manipulation that made hell function. And in the darkness between districts, flames moved with purpose that wasn't satisfaction or victory, just the patient certainty that judgment had been delivered. Not through destruction. Through clarity nobody could unsee, Ghost Rider disappeared into the sulfur haze. Left behind a media landscape slightly more honest about its own capacity for harm. And in Vox Tech Tower, Vox adjusted his tie, stared at the story he'd just committed to running. At the Empire, it would probably cost him, whispered to his own reflection. I didn't push the button. I just showed them where it was. Then deleted the last sentence. Started writing an opening that acknowledged what showing them where it was actually meant. The broadcast would air tomorrow, whether hell was ready for honesty or not. Alastor understood theater in a way most demons never would. They saw power as territory, as violence, as leverage accumulated through fear and force. How delightfully pedestrian. True power wasn't making people afraid. It was making them entertained by their own fear, converting terror into spectacle. Taking the raw material of damnation and packaging it as something worth watching. He stood in the ruins of what used to be Pride Ring's finest amphitheater, before extermination, before panic, before that tiresome entity started making everyone nervous. The building had good bones, excellent acoustics, perfect sightlines, and most importantly, nobody was using it. Alastor ran his hand along the stage. Dust rose in the dim emergency lighting that flickered with hell's usual unreliable electricity. This would do nicely. He opened his microphone case vintage naturally and began setting up equipment that predated most sinners' deaths by comfortable decades. Radio worked better than video for certain purposes. Made audiences imagine rather than observe. Gave him control over what they filled in themselves. My, he murmured to the empty theater. What a lovely venue for reconciliation. Charlie found the invitation slipped under the hotel's front door at dawn. Cream-colored cardstock, handwritten calligraphy, the kind of formal presentation that made refusal seem rude. Dearest Charlie, I find myself troubled by recent tensions. Perhaps a public forum might ease concerns. A chance for dialogue, understanding, perhaps even resolution. Tomorrow evening, the old amphitheater. Bring whomever you trust. Cordially, Alastor. She stared at the card. Read it 3 times, looking for the trap that had to be hidden in elegant script. Vaggie appeared behind her, glanced at the invitation. Absolutely not. It might be genuine. Even Charlie heard how weak that sounded. He's been helping, mostly. He's Alastor. Vaggie took the card, examined it like evidence. He doesn't do genuine. He does theater. And theater isn't safe when the director has his track record. But Charlie was already thinking. A public forum. Transparent. A chance to address the cascade of scandals that had buried the hotel under suspicion. If Alastor was offering a platform, I have to go, she said. What choice do I have? Stay silent and let narratives bury us, or use whatever opportunity presents itself. Vaggie's expression said everything her silence didn't. Us. The amphitheater filled faster than Alastor had dared hope. Word spread through channels he'd carefully seeded. A show. Answers. Entertainment in times that desperately needed distraction from fear. Sinners arrived cautiously. Found seats in rows that Alastor's volunteers had dusted and arranged. Stage lighting came up gradually, warm, inviting. The kind of glow that made everything look a touch more romantic than it actually was. Alastor stood backstage, adjusting his microphone. Testing levels, reviewing his opening. Not scripted, he was far too talented for scripts, but prepared. Every pause calculated, every inflection designed to guide rather than command. Charlie arrived with her entourage. Vaggie, Angel, Husk looking deeply uncomfortable with the whole affair. They took seats in the front row that Alastor had specifically reserved. Perfect positioning. He could play to them while performing for everyone else. The house lights dimmed. His theme music vintage swing with just a hint of menace filled the space through speakers he'd spent hours positioning for optimal effect. Alastor walked on stage, smiled, let the applause build, let the audience remember why they'd come. Good evening, sinners of pride. His voice carried without amplification through the acoustic sweet spot he'd identified during setup. What a pleasure. What a delight. What an opportunity we have tonight. He spread his arms, welcoming, inclusive. Now I know times have been... He paused. Unsettling. Change has visited our rings. Authority has been questioned. Structures we relied upon have revealed themselves as perhaps less stable than we'd hoped. Nervous laughter from the audience. Perfect. They wanted someone to acknowledge their fear while making it feel manageable. But I thought, what if we could discuss these concerns openly, honestly? Another pause. What if the princess herself could address the rumors? The scandals, the very reasonable questions about her project. He gestured to Charlie. Spotlight found her automatically. She blinked against sudden illumination. So tonight, my dear, I offer you my stage, my audience, my platform for clarity. Alastor's tone dripped magnanimity. Share your truth. Defend your vision. Help us all understand what redemption means in times like these. The trap snapped shut so gently Charlie probably didn't hear it click. Because now she had to perform. Had to justify. Had to defend her entire project in a format Alastor controlled completely. And whatever she said, however she said it, would be framed by his staging, his lighting, his opening remarks that made her sound perpetually defensive. Charlie stood, walked to the stage. Alastor offered his microphone with a bow that managed to be both courteous and mocking. She began speaking about hope, about proof, about Serpentius and the possibility of change. Alastor stood just off stage, nodding, encouraging. While his mind cataloged every word, she fumbled every argument she couldn't quite land. Every moment the audience looked uncertain. This was exquisite, not destroying her, worse. Helping her fail publicly while appearing supportive. Halfway through Charlie's explanation of redemption methodology, the temperature shifted. Not dramatic. Just enough to make breath visible. To make the warm stage lighting feel suddenly insufficient. Alastor noticed immediately. His smile never wavered, but his attention sharpened. Scanned the theater, the audience, the exits. He stood at the back. No grand entrance, no announcement. Just there. Flames outlining leather that absorbed stage lighting rather than reflecting it. The audience saw him. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Fear, curiosity, excitement at potential drama. Perfect. Alastor stepped forward, reclaimed his microphone from Charlie with another elaborate bow. My what timing? He addressed the figure directly. I was just thinking this evening needed a special guest. Care to join us on stage? Share your perspective on redemption, on justice, on whatever it is you've been accomplishing with such dramatic flair. The invitation hung in the air. Casual, friendly, absolutely a trap. Because if Ghost Rider stepped on stage, he entered Alastor's format, became part of the show, subject to staging and lighting, an audience reaction that Alastor could conduct like a symphony. And if he refused, well, that made him look unwilling to defend his actions publicly. Equally useful. Ghost Rider didn't move, didn't respond. Just stood there with that patience Alastor was beginning to find unnerving. "No," Alastor prompted. "Shy, or perhaps you prefer working without audiences." He turned to the crowd. "Though that does raise questions, doesn't it? About accountability, about who grants you authority to dispense judgment." The audience murmured agreement. Alastor had them, had the frame, had control of what this moment meant. "So I'll make it easy." He spread his arms in exaggerated welcome. "Join us. Explain yourself, or concede that perhaps you're just as arbitrary as any authority you've challenged." The ultimatum was beautifully constructed. Come forward or be framed as hypocritical. Ghost Rider took one step, then stopped, not advancing, not retreating, just stopping. The stage lights flickered, not dramatically, not storm of power flickering, just minor disruption, like someone had unplugged something crucial. Alastor's microphone cut to static. Not dead. Static. The kind that made ears ache and attention scatter. The recorded applause he'd layered into the sound system glitched. Skipped. Repeated the same hollow clap until it sounded mechanical rather than genuine. Ghost Rider took another step. Not toward the stage, toward the side exit. Alastor tried to adjust, tried to reframe. Leaving, how unfortunately predictable. Everyone. The chain moved. Not to strike, to drag. The sound scraped across every surface in the theater. Not loud, not violent, just persistently present. Impossible to tune out or talk over. It was the acoustic equivalent of someone refusing to stay in the story you'd written for them. Alastor felt his control slipping, tried to redirect. Well, this has been... The static increased. His microphone became useless. His carefully staged moment collapsed into technical difficulty that made performance impossible. Ghost Rider stopped at the threshold, turned his head, looked directly at Alastor. No challenge, no threat. Just acknowledgement that they both knew what Alastor had been attempting. Then he left. Not dramatic, just gone, taking the format with him. The house lights came up, full, harsh, revealing the amphitheater as the dust-covered ruin it actually was. Breaking the illusion of refinement Alastor had spent hours constructing. The audience sat in confused silence, waiting for resolution, for explanation, for the ending Alastor had promised. He tried to salvage, stepped forward without his microphone, opened his mouth to charm, to redirect, to convert confusion into clarity under his guidance. The temperature dropped another 20 degrees. Ghost Rider stood on the stage. No entrance, no build-up, just materialized between Alastor and his audience. But he wasn't facing the crowd. He was facing Alastor, close enough that Alastor could see his own reflection distorted in those flame-filled sockets. The chain touched his chest, gentle, precise, marking rather than striking. Fire traced a line that didn't burn fabric, burned past it, into whatever passed for Alastor's soul underneath decades of performance and careful cultivation of mystique. Every audience rushed back, every broadcast, every moment he'd taken genuine suffering and repackaged it as entertainment. Every soul who'd thought they were having dialogue when they were really just props in his narrative. He saw how they'd felt, being used, being directed, having their pain and fear converted into content for others' amusement. And worse, he saw himself doing it. Not maliciously, almost benevolently, genuinely believing he was helping by making their damnation more bearable through showmanship. The horror wasn't that he'd caused suffering. It was that he'd made suffering theatrical and called it kindness. Sound left him that wasn't quite screaming, more like feedback. Like a performer discovering their entire act was built on misunderstanding what the audience actually needed. Ghost Rider stepped back, turned to the audience that Alastor had gathered, looked at them, said nothing. The message was clear without language. This wasn't a show. This was judgment. And judgment doesn't require applause. Then he walked off stage. Through the wings, into darkness that swallowed flame as easily as it swallowed spotlight. The audience filed out in silence. No discussion, no reviews, no social media posts about the event, because they genuinely didn't know what they'd witnessed. A show that had failed. A confrontation that had no winner. An intervention they didn't understand. Alastor stayed on stage, adjusting his bow tie, smoothing his jacket, rebuilding his composure piece by careful piece. Charlie approached cautiously. "Alastor, are you fine?" His voice came out perfectly modulated. "Absolutely fine. Merely recalibrating." But his hands shook slightly. Not from fear, from the realization that he'd spent decades perfecting an art form built on fundamental misunderstanding of what power actually meant. "Did he?" Charlie searched for words. "What did he show you?" Alastor's smile never wavered, but something behind his eyes had shifted. "Nothing I didn't already know, my dear. Simply everything I'd been successfully ignoring." He walked past her, off his own stage, into wings that suddenly felt less like theatrical space and more like escape route. Back at the hotel, Charlie found Vaggie waiting. "How bad?" Vaggie asked. "I don't know." Charlie sat heavily. Alastor tried to turn it into a show, make everything theater. And Ghost Rider just... She gestured helplessly. Refused. Not aggressively. Just didn't participate in the format. And that worked. I think it did more than worked. Charlie stared at her hands. Because Alastor's power is making things mean what he wants them to mean. You can't do that if someone won't let you frame them. Vaggie processed this. "So what now?" "Now." Charlie laughed. No humor, just exhaustion. "Now I realize we've been trying to fight narrative control, stage management, framing, and maybe..." She paused. "Maybe some battles aren't won, they're just refused." Alastor reached his broadcasting room well past midnight. His equipment sat ready, prepared, waiting for his voice to give it purpose. He sat at his microphone, adjusted levels, prepared his opening, then stopped, because for the first time in decades, he genuinely didn't know what story to tell. What frame would work? What angle would make sense? He'd spent his entire existence converting chaos into narrative, making damnation digestible, packaging suffering as spectacle. And Ghost Rider had simply declined to be part of that process. Worse had shown him the faces of everyone he'd done it to. Not maliciously, not as punishment for something evil, as acknowledgement that even benevolent manipulation was still manipulation. Alastor adjusted his bow tie. Habit, comfort, armor against uncertainty. My, he whispered to the empty broadcasting room. Not everything enjoys an audience. The microphone sat silent, waiting for him to decide what came next. For once he had no idea. Across Pride Ring, in districts still recovering from cascading scandals and judgment, delivered without mercy, demons returned to routines that felt slightly less certain. Vox trying to figure out honesty. Valentino's empire crumbling. Slate's contracts voided. Loot's authority questioned. And now Alastor, master of framing genius, of narrative, conductor of chaos into entertainment. Sitting in silence because someone had simply refused to perform. Ghost Rider moved through streets that never quite slept. Not hunting, not crusading. Just existing as reminder that some things couldn't be packaged. Couldn't be framed. Couldn't be converted into content. Some things were just judgment. And judgment didn't require an audience to be real. In the hotel, Charlie stood at her window. watched smoke rise from a dozen districts where power structures were slowly, painfully learning that authority without accountability was just violence with paperwork. She didn't feel victorious, didn't feel like she was winning. But maybe, just maybe, she was starting to understand what actually needed changing. Not heaven, not hell, not even the systems themselves. The comfortable assumption that suffering could be managed, packaged, made acceptable through proper framing. That lie was what Ghost Rider kept burning away, and watching it burn was terrifying. Because underneath was just raw truth nobody had figured out how to live with yet. The next chapter would require building something new. Something that didn't rely on narrative control or theatrical packaging or careful framing of uncomfortable realities. But tonight, Charlie just watched the city burn at its usual low simmer and wondered if honest suffering was somehow more bearable than suffering made entertaining. She suspected the answer was yes, even if nobody was ready to admit it yet. Carmela Carmine didn't believe in good or evil. She believed in equilibrium. The warehouse district hummed with hell's usual industrial rhythm. Forklifts moving pallets, workers logging inventory, metal scraping metal as angelic weapons were sorted, cataloged, prepared for distribution. She walked the floor with a tablet reviewing manifests. Heaven's quarterly order had arrived on schedule. Quality control passed. Payment cleared. The transaction was clean, professional, exactly as it should be. Her daughters handled the Heaven side deliveries personally. Trusted work. Clara managed contracts. Odette supervised logistics. The family business ran with precision that made Carmela proud in ways she rarely admitted. A worker approached, nervous posture. "Ma'am, the special order from District 4. It's processed according to specifications," Carmela finished. She'd reviewed that order herself. Non-standard request. Equipment for operations outside typical extermination parameters. But the client had proper authorization codes. Payment was secure. "Ship it." The worker hesitated. "It's just the quantity. For that location. Seems above your clearance level." Carmela's tone stayed even. Not harsh, simply factual. Trust that those with appropriate clearance have made necessary assessments. She'd learned long ago that questioning every order's ultimate purpose was inefficient. Her job was supplying quality materials to authorized parties. What they did with those materials was their responsibility, their accountability. That division of labor kept hell functioning, kept violence regulated, kept chaos from becoming total. Or so she told herself during quarterly reviews when certain patterns emerged in purchasing data. Vermont. Lucifer appeared in her office without knocking. Never knocked. One of many privileges he'd simply claimed through existence rather than negotiation. Carmela, always a pleasure. He settled into her best chair without invitation. "How's business?" "Stable." She didn't look up from paperwork. "Which you already know, or you wouldn't be here." Perceptive as ever. Lucifer examined her office. Awards, certificates of quality, trade organization memberships. "I've been noticing interesting purchase patterns. Heaven's buying more, hell's buying more. But nobody's actually fighting more than usual." Carmela set down her pen, met his eyes. "Inventory management, standard practice. Building reserves prevents shortages during crisis." Or, Lucifer suggested, someone supplying both sides of operations that shouldn't exist. "I supply authorized purchasers with legally manufactured materials." Her response was rehearsed. True, carefully incomplete. If authorization is fraudulent, that's an enforcement issue, not a supplier issue. Lucifer's smile was thin. "You know, I almost admire the precision. The way you've carved responsibility into pieces so small, nobody can hold any single piece accountable. It's called civilization." Carmela returned to her paperwork. Better regulated commerce than unregulated chaos. "Is it, though?" Lucifer stood. Because regulated commerce that enables systematic violence seems functionally identical to unregulated chaos. Just with better documentation, he left. The door swung shut with a click that sounded like punctuation on an argument Carmela had no interest in continuing. She pulled up the special order manifest again. Reviewed quantities, destinations, authorization codes that checked out on every technical level while setting off quiet alarms on every instinctual one. Closed the file, approved the shipment, because if she didn't, someone else would. With worse quality control, less regulation, more actual chaos. That logic had sustained her empire for decades. No reason to doubt it now. The distribution hub operated 24 hours. Central node in Carmela's supply network. Materials arrived from manufacturing, got sorted by client, departed for final destinations across Pride Ring and beyond. Tonight's shipment included the special order. Crates marked with codes only authorized personnel could decrypt. Clara supervised loading personally. Professional, efficient. No questions about contents or purpose. The convoy departed at midnight. 3 trucks, armed escort. Standard protocol for high-value cargo. They made it 6 blocks before the temperature dropped. Not gradual. Instant. Breath crystallizing. Engine heat insufficient against cold that violated thermodynamic laws. The lead driver reached for his radio. Command, we've got static, pure, overwhelming. Every frequency simultaneously jammed. He stopped the truck. Signaled the convoy to halt. Protocol for unknown interference. The figure stood in the intersection ahead. Flames outlined against hell's ambient glow. Chain coiled with that patience the driver had heard rumors about, but never wanted to witness personally. Back up, he ordered. Alternate route, now. Too late. The chain moved. Not toward the trucks. Toward the road surface beneath them. Concrete cracked. Not explosion. Precision fracture. Creating a gap exactly wide enough to prevent vehicles from passing. No wider. No damage to cargo. Just impassable barrier where smooth road had been. Ghost Rider turned, walked toward the lead truck. The driver's hands shook on the wheel. Every instinct screamed, run. But professional training held. Sir, this is authorized shipment. Legal transport. We have documentation. The entity stopped 3 feet from the driver's window. Looked at him. Through him. Past justifications and paperwork and authorization codes to the simple question of what was actually being transported and why. The driver's radio crackled. Not static this time. Clara's voice. Convoy Alpha report status. He reached for the transmit button. Found his hand wouldn't move. Not paralyzed. Just confronted with the realization that reporting status meant acknowledging what was happening. And acknowledging meant becoming part of whatever judgment was being rendered. Ghost Rider reached out, touched the lead crate. Fire traced across the manifest number stenciled on wood. Didn't burn the crate. Burned the designation. The authorization. The paper trail that made this cargo legitimate rather than complicit. Then he moved to the second truck. Third. Same action. Marking each crate with fire that erased bureaucratic legitimacy without destroying physical materials. The drivers sat frozen, watching their cargo get audited by something that didn't care about documentation. When Ghost Rider finished, he looked at the lead driver one more time. The message was wordless, but clear. Deliver this now, and you're choosing to be more than a driver. Then he left. Didn't vanish dramatically. Just walked into the district's maze of warehouses and disappeared into shadows. The convoy sat in silence. Cargo intact but unmarked. Undocumented. No longer part of any official transaction. The lead driver picked up his radio. Command, we have a situation. Bimba. Smasaun. Carmela received the report at 1 a.m. Clara delivered it personally. Face carefully neutral. The convoy was intercepted. Cargo is physically intact, but She paused, chose words carefully. The authentication markers have been compromised. Can't verify chain of custody, can't prove authorization. Legally speaking, we're transporting undocumented materials. Carmela processed this. The entity. Witnesses confirm. He marked every crate. Didn't destroy, didn't steal, just invalidated the paperwork. Carmela stood, walked to her window, looked out at the warehouse district where her empire operated with such careful precision. "Bring the convoy back," she said. "Store the materials in quarantine. We'll need to re-establish documentation before any further movement. That could take weeks. The client will understand that regulatory compliance takes precedence over delivery schedules." Carmela's tone stayed flat. Professional. "We're a legitimate operation. We follow proper procedures." Clara left. Carmela remained at the window. She'd built her business on the foundation that regulated commerce was civilization. That proper documentation separated legitimate trade from criminal trafficking. That as long as paperwork was in order, her hands stayed clean. Ghost Rider had simply removed the paperwork. And without documentation, her materials were just weapons in transit. No authorization, no legitimacy, just complicity in whatever violence they enabled. The brilliance of it made her teeth ache. He hadn't attacked her, hadn't destroyed her inventory, hadn't even stopped the delivery directly. He'd just made the delivery illegal. Forced her to choose between maintaining her carefully constructed legitimacy or completing a shipment she couldn't officially acknowledge. Carmela returned to her terminal, pulled up other active shipments, reviewed routes, destinations, authorization codes, started calculating which ones Ghost Rider might target next. Which ones would force the same choice? Which ones would slowly, methodically dismantle the fiction that proper documentation made violence acceptable? She closed the terminal, sent a message to her distribution managers. "Suspend all special orders pending regulatory review." The response was immediate. "Ma'am, that's going to impact revenue significantly. Heaven's order alone is Heaven's problem." Carmela cut the connection. She'd spent decades building an empire on the principle that supply wasn't responsible for demand, that manufacturers weren't accountable for end use, that proper documentation absolved participation. Ghost Rider hadn't disproven that principle, just made it too expensive to maintain. Heaven received notification of the delay at dawn. The response was immediate and predictable. Carmela's communication panel lit up with priority signals, official complaints, breach of contract warnings, threats about alternative suppliers who could meet reliability standards. She handled each with professional calm, explained regulatory complications, offered revised timelines, maintained that quality control couldn't be compromised even for Heaven's convenience. What she didn't mention without her supplies: Heaven's expanded operations would slow, not stop, never stop. But slow enough to matter, enough to create gaps, enough to make the machinery of systematic violence slightly less efficient. It wasn't redemption, wasn't even ethical action by most definitions. Just pragmatic recognition that Ghost Rider had made certain business practices unprofitable. And Carmela was nothing if not pragmatic. Charlie heard about the delays through channels she'd rather not have. Connections to the underworld economy that Hazbin Hotel couldn't completely avoid despite her best efforts. Vaggie brought the news. Carmela's suspending shipments. Something about regulatory issues. That's... Charlie searched for words. Good, I think less weapons means less violence. Or, Vaggie countered, it means whoever can still get weapons has more power. Scarcity doesn't eliminate demand. It just makes supply valuable to different players. Charlie wanted to argue. Wanted to believe that disrupting Hell's arms trade would somehow improve things simply through subtraction. But she was learning slowly, painfully, that systems didn't break cleanly. They fragmented, adapted, found new equilibrium that often looked suspiciously like the old one with different labels. So it didn't fix anything, she said. It changed the math. Vaggie sat beside her. Made certain operations more expensive, harder to sustain. That's not nothing. It's just not everything. Charlie thought about Slate, about Valentino, about Vox and Alastor, and every other person who'd been judged not for being evil, but for enabling evil through careful structural distance from direct harm. Ghost Rider wasn't fixing hell, couldn't fix hell, was just making it slightly harder to profit from hell's basic functions. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all judgment could do. The thought was less comforting than she'd hoped. Lucifer found Carmela in her warehouse 3 days later. She was physically inspecting inventory. Hands-on quality control she rarely performed personally. Thought you'd appreciate the update, he said. Heaven's shifting to alternative suppliers, lower quality, higher prices, but available. Market forces. Carmela didn't stop her inspection. Supply and demand. Interesting how quickly principles about regulated commerce vanish when profit margins get challenged. I maintain standards, always have. She moved to the next pallet. If Heaven chooses to compromise quality for availability, that reflects their priorities. Does it bother you? Lucifer asked. Knowing you could resume shipments if you just ignored the entity's editorial comments, Carmela paused, set down her tablet, met Lucifer's eyes with the directness that had made her hell's most successful arms dealer for 3 centuries. Every night, she said quietly. Because I know the weapons I'm not selling will be replaced by inferior alternatives. Because I know disrupting supply chains creates chaos that harms more than it helps. Because I know my absence from the market probably makes things worse. And yet I can't pretend I'm just a neutral supplier anymore. She returned to her inspection. He didn't show me anything I didn't already know, just made it too expensive to keep pretending. Lucifer nodded. That's more honesty than most demons manage in a millennium. He left. Carmela continued her inspection, checking quality on materials that might never ship, maintaining standards for a business model that had become untenable through one entity's careful dismantling of her psychological defenses. War would continue. Violence would persist. Someone would supply the materials, but it wouldn't be her. Not at the same scale. Not with the same willing blindness. That wasn't redemption. But it was recognition. And in hell, recognition was often the best you could hope for. The shipment sat in quarantine, documented, cataloged, perfectly legal on paper. Impossible to deliver without acknowledging complicity. Carmela reviewed the file one last time, then archived it with notation, client authorization disputed, pending resolution of regulatory concerns. The notation was bureaucratic fiction. Everyone involved knew the authorization was technically valid, but technically valid had stopped being sufficient justification the night Ghost Rider had turned proper documentation into empty formality. She closed the file, opened her manufacturing specifications, started drafting new protocols, tighter authorization requirements, stricter end-use verification, standards that would reduce her profit margins significantly, while making certain kinds of complicity harder to maintain through paperwork. This wasn't redemption, wasn't even really reform, just expensive honesty. In Heaven's logistics center, planners scrambled to adjust operations. Delayed shipments meant revised schedules. Alternative suppliers meant quality concerns. The machinery of systematic violence ran less smoothly than budgeted. Lute reviewed the reports with cold fury. How long until we establish new supply chains? Weeks, her logistics officer reported. Maybe months for full capability. The alternatives aren't set up for our volume. Make it happen. Lute's tone left no room for negotiation. We don't stop because one arms dealer develops scruples. But privately, she wondered. If Hell's most reliable military contractor could be disrupted by something that didn't attack her directly, How many other seemingly stable systems were vulnerable to the same careful dismantling? The thought kept her awake at night. Ghost Rider moved through the warehouse district. Not destroying, not attacking, just existing as reminder that every transaction had context beyond documentation. The supply chains would recover, adapt, find new equilibrium. But the fiction that paperwork absolved participation had been burned away. And some fictions once destroyed never quite rebuilt the same way. Carmela stood in her empty warehouse. Workers gone for the night. Just her and rows of materials waiting for destinations she couldn't honestly send them to. The shipment wasn't canceled, just delayed. Delayed while she figured out how to run an arms business without lying to herself about what arms were actually for. The answer might be you couldn't. That realization was worth more than any quarterly revenue. Though it would take a time to feel like victory instead of defeat. Charlie stood at the boundary between Pride Ring and Heaven's jurisdiction. Neutral ground. Territory neither side controlled, but both respected, through mutual understanding that some conversations required distance from home advantage. The summons had arrived at dawn. Official seal, formal language. Request for immediate attendance regarding irregularities in documented ascension events. She knew what that meant. Serpentious. The one soul who'd actually made it. The proof that redemption wasn't theoretical. And Heaven wanted to talk about it. Vaggie stood beside her. Lucifer had come too surprisingly. He lounged against a pillar with studied indifference that didn't quite hide his attention. "They're late," Vaggie muttered. "They're making a point," Lucifer corrected. Punctuality is power. Heaven's very good at the subtle things. The portal opened precisely 15 minutes past the scheduled time. 3 angels emerged. Not exorcists. Administrative. The kind who wrote policy rather than enforced it. Their robes were pristine, faces professionally pleasant. The lead angel carried a tablet. "Miss Morningstar, thank you for attending." "You summoned me." Charlie kept her tone level. "About Pentius, about proving redemption works." "Ah, yes." The angel consulted his tablet. Scrolled through data with practiced efficiency. "The Ascension event in question. We've completed our review." Charlie's chest tightened, and there are concerns. The angel looked up, expression still pleasant, terrifyingly pleasant. About precedent, about systemic implications, about whether this particular case represents viable policy or dangerous anomaly. Vaggie's hand found Charlie's arm. "Warning, don't react. Don't give them leverage." "Dangerous?" Charlie repeated. "You're calling redemption dangerous. We're calling uncontrolled ascension dangerous." The angel's correction was smooth. "The existing framework serves important functions, maintains balance, ensures stability. One individual bypassing established procedure creates uncertainty about whether procedures themselves remain valid." "So you're here to tell me it was a mistake?" Charlie heard the edge creeping into her voice. Couldn't quite stop it. "That Pentius shouldn't have." "We're here," the angel interrupted gently, "to inform you that appropriate adjustments are being implemented. To prevent similar irregularities, to ensure the system functions as designed." Lucifer pushed off his pillar, moved to stand beside Charlie. His presence was quiet, but unmistakable. "You're denying future redemptions. We're clarifying criteria." The angel's smile never wavered. "Making standards more explicit, ensuring that ascension reflects genuine transformation rather than circumstantial fortune." "Pentius died saving his friends," Charlie said. "Died protecting people. That's not circumstantial. That's combat death during extermination." The angel consulted his tablet again. Noble, certainly, but hardly indicative of sustained behavioral modification. One moment of courage doesn't erase decades of villainy. Surely you understand the need for verification. The logic was airtight, clinical, completely detached from the reality that Pentheus had changed, had tried, had died believing he could be better. So what are you proposing? Charlie forced herself to breathe, to think past rage. Longer observation periods, more criteria. I'll work with whatever standards you need. We're proposing, the angel said quietly, that the ascension be reconsidered. The world went very still. Vaggie spoke first. Reconsidered. The individual in question may have reached heaven prematurely, based on incomplete data, based on circumstances that don't establish pattern. The angel's tone stayed relentlessly reasonable. In the interest of maintaining heaven's integrity, we believe reversal may be appropriate. Charlie's mind refused to process the words. Reversal. They wanted to undo Pentheus's redemption, to drag him back, to prove that even success could be erased if it threatened their control. You can't. Her voice came out hollow. He earned it. He changed. He proved, the angel interrupted, that the system has exploitable vulnerabilities, which we are now addressing. Lucifer's laugh was sharp, humorless. There it is. You don't fear hell, you fear losing heaven. Because if redemption works, your authority becomes optional. The angel's pleasant expression finally cracked. Just slightly. Our authority maintains order. Your daughter's project threatens that order. We are simply ensuring appropriate boundaries. By erasing proof that change is possible. Charlie found her footing, found anger that was clearer than despair. By punishing someone for succeeding at what you claim to want. We want stability. The angel closed his tablet. What you want, what you're demanding, would destabilize everything. Make hell temporary. Make damnation negotiable. Make every sinner believe they deserve second chances they haven't earned. They do deserve chances. Charlie stepped forward. Everyone does. That's the point. That's why redemption matters. Redemption, the angel said with infinite patience, cannot be allowed to be repeatable, cannot become expectation, cannot undermine the fundamental structure that gives meaning to salvation. The words hung in the air, honest, horrifying. The quiet admission that heaven's entire framework depended on redemption being impossible. Because if sinners could actually change, then eternal punishment became cruelty rather than justice, and heaven couldn't acknowledge that without collapsing its own foundation. The temperature dropped, not gradual, not natural. Cold that made breath freeze and light dim. All five of them turned. He stood at the boundary line, exactly where Pride Ring met neutral ground. Flames outlined against hell's ambient glow. Chain coiled with that patience Charlie had seen in footage, but never understood until now. Ghost Rider. The entity who'd spent weeks dismantling hell's comfortable lies about complicity and distance from harm, now standing between heaven and its attempt to erase proof that redemption worked. The angels backed up. Not fleeing, not panicking. Professional recognition of threat they hadn't expected to encounter during administrative procedure. This doesn't concern you, the late angel said. His voice shook slightly. This is heaven's internal. The chain moved, not to strike, to mark. Fire traced a line across the boundary. Not crossing into neutral ground, just defining it. Making clear where heaven's authority ended and judgment began. Ghost Rider took one step forward, into the space where neither heaven nor hell could claim jurisdiction. The angel tried again. We have legal authority to address irregularities in Ascension Protocol. Ghost Rider's head turned. Slow, deliberate, looked at the angel with hollow flame that didn't need words to ask the only question that mattered. You claim authority to erase redemption because it threatens your power. Does that make you righteous or afraid? The angel opened his mouth, closed it, because there was no answer that didn't expose the hypocrisy. Heaven preached redemption, but only as distant theoretical. only as something sinners failed at to justify eternal punishment. Actually succeeding, actually proving change was possible, that was a threat, not to order, to heaven's monopoly on mercy. The second angel stepped forward. We're not erasing redemption. We're establishing criteria. Hellfire flared. Not attacking, not threatening, just existing with intensity that made pretense impossible. Because they both knew what establishing criteria meant. Making standards so high nobody could meet them. Ensuring future Pentious cases got disqualified on technicalities. Maintaining the lie that redemption was available while systematically preventing access. Charlie watched Ghost Rider stand there. Not arguing, not explaining, just refusing to move. Refusing to let heaven access the sinner they wanted to drag back. And she understood. This wasn't about protecting Pentious specifically. It was about protecting the precedent. About making heaven acknowledge that if they wanted to undo redemption, they'd have to do it visibly, violently, proving themselves hypocrites in ways that couldn't be buried in administrative language. The lead angel's face hardened. Move aside. This is heaven's jurisdiction. No, everyone turned. Lucifer had stepped forward, positioned himself beside Ghost Rider, not allied, not friendly, just occupying the same space of refusal. Pentious is in heaven, Lucifer said quietly. By your own admission, your own process. If you want him back, you'll have to take him, forcibly, publicly, while the entity who's been judging hell's sins for weeks watches you prove you're exactly what he's been finding. The angels exchanged glances. This was supposed to be simple. Administrative correction. Nobody was supposed to physically prevent them from enforcing policy. The third angel spoke for the first time. Older voice, more authority. You're protecting a sinner who belongs to hell, interfering with heaven's internal affairs. This could be considered judgment of hypocrisy. Charlie found her voice, found the words that had been building since the conversation started. You preach redemption, but punish success. You claim authority from righteousness, but act from fear. If Ghost Rider is here, it's because you've crossed from policy into sin. The senior angel's expression went cold. We are heaven. We define sin. Hellfire traced a circle around the boundary. Not prison, not attack, just demarcation. The line between administrative procedure and moral crime. Charlie understood. Ghost Rider wasn't stopping them. Couldn't stop them. Heaven's authority in heaven was absolute. But if they crossed this line, if they tried to take Pentious back, they'd have to do it as an action Ghost Rider could judge. Not as paperwork. As violence against someone who'd earned redemption. And violence against the redeemed wasn't justice. It was murder wearing righteousness as camouflage. The senior angel stared at the circle. At Ghost Rider. At Lucifer and Charlie refusing to step aside. Calculating. Weighing. Deciding if enforcing policy was worth being visibly, publicly, undeniably wrong. This isn't over, he said finally. We will address these irregularities through appropriate channels, which means committees and procedures and delays that never quite resolve. Lucifer's tone was pleasant. While Pentious stays where he earned the right to be, I can live with that timeline. The angels retreated, portal opening behind them. The senior angel paused at the threshold. Your hotel will be monitored. Future ascension attempts will face extreme scrutiny. This precedent will not repeat. Then we'll make new precedents. Charlie kept her voice steady. We'll keep proving redemption works until you run out of excuses to deny it. The angel's expression suggested he didn't believe that was possible. The portal closed. Silence descended. Ghost Rider's flames dimmed slightly. Not extinguished, just receding. The crisis had passed. The judgment delivered. Heaven had tried to erase proof of redemption. had been forced to retreat rather than commit murder to do it. That wasn't victory. But it was acknowledgement.
Nah.
Charlie collapsed against the nearest pillar. Adrenaline draining, leaving exhaustion and confusion and desperate need to understand what had just happened. Lucifer approached, offered his hand, helped her stand. They'll come back with better paperwork, more elaborate justifications. I know. Charlie looked at where Ghost Rider still stood. But they'll have to do it while he's watching. While everyone's watching. They can't hide behind procedure anymore. Can't they? Vaggy's voice was sharp. They're heaven. They wrote the rules. They can rewrite them to mean whatever they need, not without proving themselves hypocrites. Charlie turned to Ghost Rider. That's what you showed them, isn't it? That claiming righteousness while acting from fear is just another sin. Ghost Rider didn't respond. Didn't need to. His presence was answer enough. Lucifer studied the entity with something approaching respect. You didn't come to save hell or fix heaven. You came to make both sides stop lying about what they actually are. The flames flickered. Acknowledgement. Agreement. Then Ghost Rider turned, walked back toward Pride Ring, chain scraping one final mark across ground that would remember tonight as the moment heaven's absolute authority met something that refused to recognize it. Charlie watched him disappear into hell's perpetual haze. Will he stay? Keep judging? Does it matter? Lucifer's tone was oddly gentle. He did what he came to do. Burned away the lies everyone used to make damnation comfortable. What happens next is up to us. Back at the hotel, Charlie found herself in the lobby at 3 a.m. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't process. Couldn't reconcile the night's events with anything resembling victory. Heaven had retreated, but not surrendered. Pensius was safe, but only because enforcing heaven's policy would expose their hypocrisy too publicly to ignore. That wasn't redemption. It was stalemate bought with threat of judgment. Vaggy found her there, sat without speaking. They watched Pride ring through the windows, the city burning at its usual low simmer, slightly less certain than before, slightly more aware that authority without accountability was just violence wearing different clothes. We didn't win, Charlie said quietly. No, Vaggy agreed. But we didn't lose. The hotel's still here. Pensius is still in heaven. And every demon in Pride Ring just watched heaven back down from someone who wouldn't let them hide behind procedure. Is that enough? Vaggy was quiet for a long moment. It's more than yesterday. And tomorrow, we'll try for more than today. That's all redemption ever is. Not transformation overnight, just choosing better tomorrow than you did today. Charlie leaned against her, exhausted, uncertain, but not defeated. The hotel light stayed on. No approval from heaven. No forgiveness from hell. No validation that what she was doing mattered. Just proof that redemption didn't need permission to exist. That it happened in spite of systems designed to prevent it. That it survived even when authorities tried to erase it. That it was real because people chose to be better, not because anyone authorized improvement. Heaven could deny redemption all they wanted. The truth would keep inconveniently existing anyway. Ghost Rider moved through Pride Ring. Not hunting, not judging, just walking streets that felt slightly less comfortable with their own moral compromises. Slate wouldn't trade in souls anymore. Valentino's infrastructure lay in ruins. Vox struggled with honesty. Alastor couldn't hide behind performance. Carmela's supply chains had stalled. Loot's authority was questioned, and heaven absolute righteous, untouchable. Heaven had been forced to choose between murdering the redeemed or admitting they feared redemption's success. They'd chosen admission, temporarily, reluctantly, but chosen nonetheless. The work wasn't finished. Could never be finished. Because systems didn't break cleanly. They adapted, found new equilibrium that looked suspiciously like old exploitation with better framing. But tonight, Ghost Rider had made one thing clear. Some lies were too expensive to maintain. Some hypocrisies too visible to ignore. Some judgments too patient to outlast. He stopped at the boundary of Pride Ring. Looked back at the city he'd spent weeks forcing to confront its own comfortable distance from suffering it enabled. Then he continued walking, into darkness, into whatever came next. Because judgment didn't end, it just moved on. And somewhere behind him, a hotel full of broken people trying to be better kept its lights burning. Not because anyone said they could, because they chose to anyway. That was enough. For now, 3 weeks after the tribunal, Charlie found herself fixing a broken hinge on the front door. Manual labor. Simple. Grounding. The hotel hadn't gained popularity. If anything, the opposite. Hell's rumor mill had decided that associating with a place that attracted that kind of attention was poor survival strategy. Better to stay invisible. Better to handle damnation privately. She twisted the screwdriver. The hinge squeaked, but held. Good enough. Angel emerged for his shift at the bar. Actually emerged. Not skulking, not bracing for violence. Valentino's empire remained fractured. Infrastructure destroyed. The contracts still bound, but the machinery of enforcement lay scattered across districts that nobody wanted to touch anymore. Coffee, Angel offered. Please. Charlie accepted the mug, sat on the lobby steps, watched morning light such as it was in hell filter through cracked windows she kept meaning to replace. Nobody discussed what had happened. The entity, the judgments, the cascade of revelations that had stripped comfortable distance from complicity. They just existed differently now. Husk polished glasses with his usual mechanical rhythm. But twice this week, he'd actually asked guests how they were doing. Small thing, massive for him. Massive. Nifty cleaned with the same manic energy. But she'd stopped humming while she worked. Like even her relentless cheer had acknowledged something fundamental had shifted. Vaggie came downstairs, sat beside Charlie without speaking. They shared the coffee, watched Pride Ring wake to another day of being slightly more honest about what it actually was. Heaven sent another inquiry, Vaggie said eventually, about our operations, standards, verification procedures. Of course they did. Charlie didn't feel angry, just tired. What did you tell them? That we're still here. Still operating, still proving change is possible, whether they acknowledge it or not. Charlie smiled. Small, real. Did they respond? Not yet. Vaggie leaned against her shoulder. Probably won't for months. Bureaucracy moves slow when it's scared. Through the window, Pride Ring carried on. Overlords moving carefully. Sinners watching their own backs more closely. The machinery of exploitation still functioned, but with awareness that some justifications no longer worked. Vox ran his network with marginally more honesty. Not virtuous. Just expensive to maintain complete fabrication when audiences remembered he'd been forced to acknowledge his own complicity. Carmela's warehouses sat partially idle. Materials gathering dust, while she recalibrated what legitimate business actually meant when you couldn't hide behind documentation. Alastor broadcast with less certainty. Still charming, still dangerous, but unable to package suffering as entertainment quite so effortlessly anymore. Lute's forces operated with restraint that came from watching a colleague broken by acknowledging her own actions. Not mercy. Fear of being next. None of it was redemption. Most of it wasn't even improvement. Just hell being forced to remember that distance from harm didn't equal innocence. A sinner approached the hotel entrance. Young, nervous. The kind who'd been avoiding attention since extermination became unpredictable. Charlie recognized the posture. Someone considering change, terrified of what that meant. Can I? The sinner gestured vaguely. Is this place real? Or Or just another scam? Charlie thought about how to answer. 3 weeks ago, she would have launched into passionate explanation. Proof. Evidence. Pensious ascending. Now she just opened the door wider. We're trying. Success not guaranteed, but we're actually trying. The sinner studied her, looking for the catch, the hidden cost. That's it, just trying. That's everything. Charlie stepped aside. Coffee's hot. First consultation is free. We'll figure out the rest as we go. The sinner entered. Still uncertain, still scared, but choosing to try anyway. That was enough. Lucifer materialized in the lobby at midnight. Charlie was reviewing paperwork by lamplight. Guest intake forms, progress notes, documentation that heaven would scrutinize and probably dismiss, but she kept anyway. Still at it, Lucifer observed. Still have work to do. He examined the hotel. The worn furniture, the cracks in the walls. The persistent evidence that salvation wasn't glamorous or easy or guaranteed. You know they'll keep testing you, he said. Keep looking for reasons to shut this down. I know. Charlie set it down her pen. They're scared, not of us failing, of us succeeding. Lucifer's expression carried something almost resembling pride. You've learned. Had good teachers? She gestured to the empty lobby, the space where an entity had stood and refused to let systems erase their own failures, even the ones who didn't use words. Interesting thing about judgment, Lucifer said quietly. It never stays where you leave it. He vanished before Charlie could ask what he meant. Probably intentional. Lucifer loved dramatic exits, but she understood. The weeks of relentless accountability had changed calculations, made certain lies too expensive, made comfortable distance from harm slightly harder to maintain. That ripple wouldn't stop, couldn't stop, because once people saw their own complicity, clearly forgetting required effort, and effort created vulnerability to the next judgment. In the streets beyond the hotel, life continued. Sinners adapted. Overlords adjusted. Systems found new equilibrium that resembled old exploitation with better vocabulary. But sometimes in alleys where deals were struck in warehouses, where materials changed hands in broadcast booths, where narratives were crafted, people hesitated, not from virtue, from memory of what happened when justifications were burned away. Somewhere in a district, most demons avoided scorch marks remained on pavement. Chain links traced into concrete. Physical evidence that something had passed through. Something that judged without mercy, but with absolute precision. Nobody touched the marks. Not from respect. From uncertainty whether touching would attract attention nobody wanted. The marks would fade eventually. Weather and time and hell's usual entropy would erase them. But the awareness would remain. The understanding that some actions created accountability that paperwork couldn't defer. That was the legacy. Not salvation, not reform. Just the uncomfortable knowledge that lying had become more expensive. Charlie finished her paperwork, filed it properly. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new guests, new evidence that change was possible even when authorities denied it. She walked through the lobby, checked locks, adjusted lights. The mundane maintenance of keeping a hotel running in a realm designed to make improvement impossible. The front desk still needed repairs. The paint still peeled. The structure remained fragile, but it remained, despite scandal, despite surveillance, despite every systemic pressure designed to prove redemption was fantasy. The hotel existed as proof that change didn't need permission, didn't require validation. Happened anyway when people chose to be better than systems told them they could be. That proof terrified heaven more than any army. That terror was leverage. Not enough to win, enough to survive. And survival was how revolution started. Dawn broke over Pride Ring. Such as dawn existed in a realm of perpetual twilight. Charlie stepped outside. Breathed air that smelled of sulfur and industrial waste. The distant echo of violence that never quite stopped. The sign above the door flickered. Hazbin Hotel. Half the letters worked. The other half struggled. She made a note to fix it. Added it to the list of 100 other things that needed attention. The doors stayed open. No crowds lined up. No celebration of success. No validation from authorities that what she was doing mattered. Just quiet persistence in the face of systems designed to make it fail. That was enough. For now.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss out future videos. Thank you for watching and we will see you next time.